In the suffocating darkness of a suburban Chicago crawl space, 26 rotting corpses lay buried beneath the floorboards of 8213 West Somerdale Avenue. The stench of death had been seeping through the house for years, masked by lime and the owner's casual explanations of sewer problems. But on December 11th, 1978, when police finally descended into that hellish tomb, they discovered something far more sinister than broken pipes. They had uncovered the largest crime scene in American history, a house of horrors where a monster in grease paint had systematically tortured, raped, and murdered young men for nearly a decade. This is the story of John Wayne Gacy, a man who entertained children by day as Pogo the Clown and butchered them by night in acts of unimaginable brutality. The green-painted walls of his house could tell 1,000 stories. Stories of young lives taken too soon, of trust betrayed, of lives lost in the hands of a man who walked among them unnoticed. The fact that he was a clown, a figure meant to entertain and bring joy, only makes the horror of his actions even more chilling. Welcome to a nightmare that proves sometimes the most terrifying monsters hide behind the brightest smiles. Welcome to Crime Headquarters. I know many of you use these stories to unwind and drift off to sleep, but tonight, you're in for a very scary, very tragic one. So, get cozy, whether you're in bed or somewhere comfortable, and let go of the day. Before you let your mind drift off, take a moment to subscribe, like, share, and comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Now, take a deep breath. Relax and get ready. You're about to hear one of the most chilling and horrific true crime stories in history. John Wayne Gacy, the Killer Clown. Ready? Let's begin. The first scream John Wayne Gacy ever heard was his own. Born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, Gacy entered a world that would systematically destroy whatever innocence he might have possessed. His father, John Stanley Gacy, was a violent alcoholic whose rage knew no bounds. The elder Gacy's leather belt became an instrument of terror, whistling through the air before connecting with flesh in a symphony of pain that echoed through their modest home. John Wayne's childhood was painted in bruises and soaked in tears. His father's venomous words cut deeper than any physical blow. "You're nothing but a worthless mama's boy," the older man would snarl, his breath reeking of whiskey and hatred. "You'll never amount to anything." These psychological wounds festered like infected sores, poisoning young Gacy's developing mind with a toxic mixture of rage, shame, and an insatiable hunger for control. At age 11, a playground accident left Gacy with a blood clot on his brain, triggering seizures that would plague him for years. His father showed no sympathy, instead viewing the condition as another sign of his son's weakness. "Faker," he would hiss whenever the boy collapsed in convulsions. "Just another excuse to get attention." The medical episodes left Gacy feeling powerless, vulnerable sensations he would later inflict upon others with sadistic precision. School offered no refuge from the nightmare at home. Gacy struggled academically, his concentration shattered by the constant fear of his father's next explosion. He was overweight, awkward, and increasingly isolated from his peers. The other children sensed something different about him, something that made their skin crawl even when they couldn't articulate why. He would watch them from the shadows of the playground, his pale eyes studying their movements with an intensity that was deeply unsettling. As adolescence arrived, so did Gacy's first taste of the power that would eventually consume him. He began targeting younger, smaller children not for friendship, but for domination. He would corner them in empty classrooms or abandoned lots, using his superior size to intimidate and control. These early experiments in manipulation gave him a dark thrill, a temporary relief from his own feelings of powerlessness. The teenage years brought new horrors as Gacy's sexuality began to emerge in twisted, violent ways. Confused by his attraction to other males in a society that condemned such feelings, he buried these desires beneath layers of rage and self-loathing. His father's homophobic rants only added fuel to the fire burning in his damaged psyche. "I'd rather have a dead son than a queer one," John Stanley would declare, unknowingly prophesying the countless deaths that lay ahead. In 1962, at age 20, Gacy enrolled in Northwestern Business College, desperate to escape his father's shadow. But the demons followed him. His first serious relationship was with a fellow student named Marlon Myers, whose father owned a chain of Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants. Gacy saw this connection as his ticket to respectability, to the normal life that seemed to elude him at every turn. They married in 1964, and Gacy threw himself into the role of dutiful husband and ambitious businessman. He moved to Waterloo, Iowa, to manage one of his father-in-law's restaurants, determined to prove his worth. On the surface, he appeared to be succeeding. The restaurant flourished under his management, and he became involved in local politics and community organizations. He joined the JCs, rising through the ranks with his charismatic personality and apparent dedication to civic duty. But beneath this carefully constructed facade, something monstrous was stirring. Gacy's involvement with the JCs provided him with access to young men, and he began hosting parties at his home where alcohol flowed freely and inhibitions were lowered. These gatherings became hunting grounds where Gacy would identify potential victims, vulnerable young men who could be easily manipulated or overpowered. The first documented assault occurred in 1967. Donald Voorhees Jr., the teenage son of a fellow JC, came forward with allegations that would shatter Gacy's carefully maintained image. The boy described in horrifying detail how Gacy had lured him to his home under the pretense of work, then forced him to perform oral sex at knife point. But this wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the first time someone had been brave enough to speak out. As the investigation deepened, more victims emerged from the shadows. Young men told stories of being drugged at Gacy's parties, waking up to find themselves being sexually assaulted by their host. The picture that emerged was of a predator who used his position of trust and authority to systematically abuse those under his influence. Gacy's response to these allegations revealed the calculating manipulator he had become. He didn't deny the encounters but claimed they were consensual, painting his victims as willing participants or even instigators. When that defense failed, he resorted to intimidation and threats. He hired thugs to beat up Donald Voorhees Jr., sending a clear message to other potential witnesses about the cost of speaking out against him. But the walls were closing in. In 1968, Gacy was charged with oral sodomy and sentenced to 10 years in prison. As he was led away in shackles, his mask of respectability finally slipped, revealing the cold, calculating predator beneath. Marlon filed for divorce, taking their children and disappearing from his life forever. His father-in-law's business empire was closed to him permanently. Everything he had worked to build was gone in an instant, but perhaps most terrifyingly, prison didn't reform John Wayne Gacy, it educated him. Behind bars, he learned from seasoned criminals about evading detection, disposing of evidence, and selecting victims who wouldn't be missed. He studied the mistakes that had led to his capture, vowing never to be so careless again. The system that was supposed to rehabilitate him instead created something far more dangerous, a monster who had learned to hunt more efficiently. During his incarceration, Gacy's rage continued to fester and grow. He blamed everyone but himself for his predicament: the victims who had seduced him, the justice system that had persecuted him, and society that had failed to understand him. This narrative of victimhood would become central to his identity, allowing him to justify increasingly horrific acts as merely evening the score. He was released on parole in June 1970, after serving just 18 months of his 10-year sentence. The parole board believed his claims of rehabilitation, seeing a man who had supposedly found religion and reformed his ways. They couldn't have been more wrong. John Wayne Gacy was about to embark on a killing spree that would terrorize Chicago and shock the world. The monster had been unleashed, and this time, he wouldn't make the same mistakes that had led to his capture. As he walked out of those prison gates, Gacy carried with him not just the lessons he had learned from fellow inmates, but a burning hatred that demanded satisfaction. The boy who had been brutalized by his father, humiliated by his peers, and rejected by society was gone. In his place stood something infinitely more dangerous, a predator who had learned to hide his true nature behind masks both literal and figurative. The killer clown was about to be born, and Chicago would never be the same. The morning sun cast long shadows across the suburban streets of Chicago as John Wayne Gacy surveyed his new hunting ground. Fresh out of prison and relocated back to Illinois, he had one overriding obsession. Never again would he be caught off guard. Never again would his carefully constructed world crumble around him. This time, he would be smarter, more calculating, and infinitely more dangerous. Gacy's first move was brilliant in its simplicity. He purchased a modest ranch house at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue in Norwood Park, a quiet suburban neighborhood where neighbors minded their own business and strange smells could be attributed to faulty plumbing. The house would become his fortress, his laboratory, and ultimately, his tomb for the dozens of young men who would never leave alive. But it was his creation of PDM contractors that truly demonstrated his evolution as a predator. The construction company wasn't just a business. It was the perfect cover for his murderous activities. Construction work explained the strange odors wafting from his property, the frequent digging in his yard, and the steady stream of young men coming and going from his house. More importantly, it provided him with an endless supply of potential victims. Gacy had an uncanny ability to identify vulnerability. He prowled Chicago's streets like a shark sensing blood in the water, targeting runaways, drifters, and young men estranged from their families. These were society's forgotten individuals whose disappearances would generate minimal police investigation and even less media attention. He would approach them with job offers, promising steady work and decent pay to desperate young men who had few other options. The predator had learned to perfect his act. Gone was the clumsy amateur who had been caught assaulting teenagers in Iowa. In his place stood a master manipulator who could read people's weaknesses and exploit them with surgical precision. He would size up potential victims like a butcher examining livestock, noting their desperation, their loneliness, their need for acceptance and belonging. Timothy McCoy was among the first to fall into Gacy's web. The 16-year-old had been hitchhiking through Chicago when Gacy offered him a ride and a place to stay for the night. Timothy was everything Gacy looked for in a victim: young, alone, and unlikely to be missed quickly. That night in 1972, Timothy became the first of many to experience the full horror of Gacy's basement. What happened to Timothy McCoy in those final hours remains one of the most disturbing aspects of Gacy's crimes. According to Gacy's own twisted confessions, he would drug his victims with alcohol or pills, then take them to his basement where the real nightmare began. He had converted the space into his own private torture chamber, complete with restraints, weapons, and tools designed to inflict maximum pain and terror. The rope trick became Gacy's signature method of murder, though calling it a trick trivializes the horrific reality of what he did to his victims. He would loop a rope around their necks, insert a stick, and slowly twist it tighter and tighter. But this wasn't a quick death. Gacy prolonged the agony, loosening the rope when his victims neared unconsciousness, reviving them, then beginning the torture anew. During these final moments, Gacy would often don his clown costume, transforming into Pogo the Clown, a character he had created for local children's parties. The sight of that grotesque painted face would be the last thing many of his victims ever saw. He delighted in their terror, feeding off their desperation as they begged for their lives. The only thing they're good for is fertilizer, he would later tell investigators, revealing the complete dehumanization of his victims in his twisted mind. But Gacy's most chilling trait wasn't his brutality. It was his ability to compartmentalize. By day, he was the successful businessman, the community volunteer, the entertaining clown who brought joy to children's birthday parties. His Pogo the Clown persona became locally famous, and parents eagerly hired him for their children's celebrations, never suspecting that those same hands that painted balloon animals were also capable of unspeakable violence. The construction business thrived as Gacy employed his victims as workers, often for just a few days or weeks before they quit or moved on to other opportunities. His employees noticed the high turnover rate, but Gacy always had reasonable explanations. Young men were unreliable, he would explain with a sad shake of his head. They would work for a few days, collect their pay, then disappear without notice. It was a frustrating part of running a business that employed transient workers. What his employees couldn't know was that many of these unreliable workers were buried beneath their feet as they worked on various job sites around Chicago. Gacy had become expert at disposal, using his construction knowledge to create graves that would remain undiscovered for years. Lime helped mask the smell of decomposition, and concrete poured over burial sites ensured the bodies would never be found by accident. As the body count mounted, Gacy's confidence grew. He began taking greater risks, killing more frequently, and displaying an almost supernatural ability to avoid detection. The police were never called when his workers disappeared, because there was nothing obviously suspicious about their departure. These young men were drifters by nature, and their absence was easily explained away. But the deaths weren't just about murder, they were about power, control, and revenge against a world that had rejected him. Each victim represented everyone who had ever hurt him. His abusive father, his disapproving mother, his former wife who had abandoned him, the society that had imprisoned him. Through torture and murder, Gacy was evening the score, inflicting upon others the pain and humiliation he had endured throughout his life. The psychological profile of Gacy during this period reveals a man living multiple lives simultaneously. To his neighbors, he was John Gacy, the friendly contractor who threw elaborate parties and helped with community projects. To local Democratic politicians, he was a valuable volunteer who could rally support and organize events. To children, he was Pogo the Clown, a magical figure who could make them laugh and forget their troubles. But in the darkness of his basement, he was something else entirely, a predator whose appetite for violence seemed insatiable. The killings followed a pattern that would become his trademark. The initial approach and seduction of the victim, the drugging and incapacitation, the torture and sexual assault, and finally, the slow, agonizing death by ligature strangulation. One of the most horrifying aspects of this period was how easily Gacy moved between these different personas. He could murder a teenager in his basement, bury the body in his yard, then shower, change clothes, and appear at a political fundraiser an hour later, charming donors and making small talk about municipal issues. This ability to compartmentalize his life allowed him to function normally in society while simultaneously carrying out one of the most prolific serial killing sprees in American history. The house on Somerdale Avenue became a monument to his victims' suffering. Each body buried in the crawl space represented not just a life cut short, but a family destroyed, dreams shattered, and potential forever lost. Yet Gacy felt no remorse for his actions. In his twisted worldview, these young men had chosen their fate by accepting his offers of work or shelter. They had made themselves available to him, and he had simply taken what was offered. As 1975 drew to a close, John Wayne Gacy had perfected his system of predation. He had learned to identify ideal victims, lure them to his home, torture and kill them, and dispose of their bodies without arousing suspicion. His business was thriving, his political connections were strong, and his reputation in the community was sterling. He had successfully created the perfect cover for his murderous activities. But even the most careful predator makes mistakes, and Gacy's overconfidence was beginning to show. The crawl space beneath his house was running out of room, forcing him to be more creative with body disposal. The smell was becoming harder to explain away, even with liberal applications of lime and creative excuses about sewer problems. Most dangerously, he was beginning to believe his own press, that he was smarter than everyone around him and would never be caught. The stage was being set for the next phase of his killing spree, a period that would see his bloodlust reach new heights and his methods become even more depraved. The friendly neighborhood contractor was about to become the most notorious serial killer in American history, and the bodies buried beneath his house were just the beginning. The stench of death had become John Wayne Gacy's constant companion by 1975, seeping through the floorboards of his Somerdale Avenue home like an invisible fog of evil. But far from deterring him, the smell only seemed to fuel his bloodlust. If anything, it served as a grotesque reminder of his power, the ultimate evidence that he held the power of life and death over the vulnerable young men who crossed his path. The basement had become a charnel house, its walls witnesses to unspeakable horrors that would haunt investigators for decades. Gacy had transformed the space into his personal torture chamber, complete with restraints bolted to the walls, a workbench lined with instruments of pain, and a collection of ropes, chains, and handcuffs that served as the tools of his trade. The concrete floor bore dark stains that no amount of bleach could erase, permanent reminders of the terror that had unfolded in that underground hell. It was during this period that Gacy's methods became truly systematic, refined through years of practice into a horrifying science of murder. He had learned to read his victims like open books, identifying their deepest fears and using them as weapons. Some begged for their mothers in their final moments, others pleaded for their lives, promising anything if only he would let them go. Gacy fed off this desperation like a vampire feeding on blood, each plea and whimper adding to his sense of absolute control. The handcuff trick became one of his favorite methods of subduing victims. He would demonstrate how he could escape from handcuffs as a party trick, then challenge his victims to try the same feat, but the handcuffs he placed on them had been specially modified. There was no escape. Once secured, his victims were completely at his mercy, and John Wayne Gacy had no mercy to give. Billy Carroll was one of the many young men who fell victim to this deception. The 17-year-old had been working odd jobs around Chicago when Gacy approached him with an offer of steady construction work. Billy was everything Gacy looked for: young, desperate, and estranged from his family. When he failed to return home that night, his worried mother called the police, but they assured her that teenage boys often stayed out all night. They had no way of knowing that Billy was already dead, buried beneath Gacy's house alongside the growing collection of bodies. The disposal of corpses had become an increasingly complex logistical challenge for Gacy. The crawl space beneath his house could only hold so many bodies before structural integrity became an issue. He had become expert at spatial arrangement, stacking bodies like cordwood and using lime to accelerate decomposition. When asked later about his methods, he described the process with the same clinical detachment a contractor might use to discuss a renovation project. But it was during the summer of 1977 that Gacy's killing spree reached its most frenzied pace. The hot Chicago weather accelerated decomposition, making the smell from his house nearly unbearable. Neighbors began to complain about the odor, but Gacy had perfected his explanations. Sewer problems, he would tell them with a sad shake of his head. The city was supposed to fix it, but you know how bureaucracy works. Most neighbors accepted this explanation, never suspecting that the smell came from the rotting corpses of murder victims buried just feet from where they walked their dogs and played with their children. John Butkovich became one of Gacy's most significant victims during this period, not because his death was any more brutal than the others, but because his disappearance would eventually lead investigators to Gacy's door. The 18-year-old had been working for PDM contractors when he got into a dispute with Gacy over unpaid wages. John was young but not naive. He knew he was being cheated and wasn't afraid to confront his boss about it. Their final confrontation took place on a cold December evening in 1977. Butkovich had come to Gacy's house to demand his money, threatening to go to the authorities if he wasn't paid what he was owed. It was exactly the kind of threat that sent Gacy into a homicidal rage. This young man was challenging his authority, questioning his power, and that was something John Wayne Gacy could never tolerate. What happened next followed Gacy's established pattern of deception and brutality. He invited Butkovich inside to discuss the matter, offering him a drink to calm things down. The drink, of course, was drugged. As the young man began to lose consciousness, Gacy's mask of reasonable employer slipped away, revealing the monster beneath. Butkovich's final moments were filled with the horrifying realization that he had walked into a trap from which there was no escape. The torture that followed was particularly savage, even by Gacy's standards. Butkovich had dared to threaten him, to challenge his authority, and Gacy made sure he paid dearly for that transgression. The ligature strangulation that finally ended the young man's suffering took nearly an hour, with Gacy repeatedly loosening and tightening the rope to prolong the agony. But John Butkovich's death would prove to be different from the others in one crucial way. His family refused to accept his disappearance. His mother, exhausted by police indifference, hired a private investigator who began asking uncomfortable questions about PDM contractors and its owner. The investigation was still in its early stages, but it represented the first crack in the wall of silence that had protected Gacy for so long. Meanwhile, the killings continued with terrifying regularity. Gregory Godzik, a 17-year-old who had worked briefly for PDM, disappeared in December 1976. His body would later be found in Gacy's crawl space, reduced to skeletal remains that bore the telltale signs of ligature strangulation. John Scyc, another teenager who had crossed Gacy's path, met the same fate. His car was found abandoned miles from his home, but his body was buried beneath Gacy's kitchen. Each victim had their own story, their own dreams and aspirations that were snuffed out in Gacy's basement of horrors. Some were runaways seeking a fresh start. Others were young men working to support their families. All of them shared the misfortune of encountering a predator who viewed them not as human beings, but as objects to be used and discarded. The psychological transformation of Gacy during this period was as frightening as his escalating body count. He had moved beyond simple murder into realms of sadistic pleasure that defied human understanding. He would often keep his victims alive for hours, sometimes days, subjecting them to tortures that served no purpose other than to satisfy his twisted appetites. The rope tricks became increasingly elaborate, with Gacy developing variations that prolonged suffering while maintaining his victims' consciousness. He would position mirrors so his victims could watch their own torture, feeding off their horror and despair. The basement became a theater of cruelty where Gacy was both director and audience, orchestrating symphonies of pain that satisfied something deeply broken in his psyche. But perhaps most disturbing was his ability to return to normal life after these episodes of extreme violence. He would emerge from his basement covered in blood and bodily fluids, shower off the evidence of his crimes, then attend political meetings or perform as Pogo the Clown at children's parties. This compartmentalization wasn't just a survival mechanism. It was evidence of a mind that had moved far beyond conventional concepts of sanity. The Democratic Party of Cook County continued to welcome John Gacy as a valuable volunteer, never suspecting that their enthusiastic supporter was simultaneously conducting one of history's most prolific killing sprees. His photograph appeared in newspapers standing beside political candidates, his broad smile masking the darkness that consumed his soul. He had achieved the respectability he had always craved, built on a foundation of rotting corpses and shattered lives. As 1978 dawned, Gacy's confidence had reached dangerous levels. He believed himself untouchable, protected by his reputation and political connections. The basement was nearly full of bodies, forcing him to get creative with disposal methods. Some victims were buried in his backyard, others were disposed of in local rivers, and a few were even buried under his garage. The house had become a sprawling cemetery, with the living walking unknowingly above the dead. But the walls were beginning to close in, even if Gacy couldn't see it yet. The Butkovich investigation was gaining momentum, and other families were beginning to ask questions about their missing sons. The smell from his house was becoming harder to explain, and neighbors were growing suspicious. Most importantly, his luck was about to run out in the most spectacular way possible. The stage was being set for the encounter that would finally bring down the killer clown. Robert Piest, a 15-year-old with dreams of becoming a pharmacist, was about to cross paths with John Wayne Gacy on a cold December evening. Unlike the previous victims, Robert wouldn't disappear without a trace. His disappearance would trigger an investigation that would uncover one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history and finally bring justice for the dozens of young men who had died in Gacy's Chamber of Horrors. December 11th, 1978, started like any other winter day in Chicago, but it would end with the discovery of one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and a bitter wind whipped through the streets of Norwood Park as 15-year-old Robert Piest finished his shift at Nissen Pharmacy. The bright, ambitious teenager had dreams of becoming a pharmacist himself, saving money for college while working part-time to help support his family. It was supposed to be a simple encounter, a potential job interview that would never happen. John Wayne Gacy had entered the pharmacy that evening, ostensibly to discuss a renovation project with the owner. But his predatory instincts had been triggered the moment he laid eyes on young Robert Piest. Here was another perfect victim, young, trusting, and in need of money. As Gacy prepared to leave, he approached the teenager with his well-rehearsed pitch. "I run a construction company," Gacy told the boy, his voice smooth and reassuring. "I could use someone like you. The pay is good, better than what you're making here. Why don't you come by my house tonight and we can discuss the details?" Robert, eager for the opportunity to earn more money, agreed to meet Gacy after his shift ended. But Robert Piest made one crucial mistake that would ultimately save countless future victims. He told his mother where he was going. "I'll be back soon," he promised Elizabeth Piest. "Some contractor wants to talk to me about a job that pays $5 an hour." Those were the last words she would ever hear her son speak. When Robert failed to return home that night, his mother immediately knew something was wrong. This wasn't like her responsible, reliable son. She called the police, and for once, the authorities took a missing person report seriously. Perhaps it was the boy's age, or his clean-cut appearance, or simply the urgency in his mother's voice. But Detective Lieutenant Joseph Kozenzak, assigned to the case, decided to pursue every lead aggressively. The investigation led them quickly to John Wayne Gacy. Pharmacy employees remembered the contractor who had spoken with Robert, and it didn't take long to track down PDM Contractors and its owner. When police arrived at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue on December 13th, they found Gacy surprisingly cooperative. He denied any knowledge of Robert Piest's whereabouts, claiming he had never offered the boy a job. But Detective Kozenzak wasn't satisfied with Gacy's explanations. Something about the man's demeanor set off alarm bells. The too ready answers, the slightly forced smile, the way his eyes never quite met the detective's gaze. Most importantly, there was a smell permeating the house, a sickly sweet odor that experienced investigators recognized all too well. "Sewer problems," Gacy explained with a weary sigh when questioned about the smell. "The city keeps promising to fix it, but you know how that goes." He had used this explanation dozens of times before with neighbors and visitors, and it had always worked. But Detective Kozenzak wasn't buying it. The search warrant that followed would expose John Wayne Gacy as one of history's most prolific serial killers. On December 21, 1978, investigators began the grim task of excavating the crawl space beneath Gacy's house. What they found defied human comprehension: a makeshift cemetery containing the decomposed remains of 26 victims, their bodies contorted in positions that spoke of unimaginable suffering. The first body was discovered just hours into the excavation, buried in a shallow, lime-filled grave. The remains were those of a young man, probably in his teens, who had been dead for months or possibly years. As investigators continued digging, the horrible scope of Gacy's crimes became apparent. Body after body was unearthed, each one a testament to the systematic brutality that had been carried out in this suburban house of horrors. The basement itself told its own story of terror. Investigators found restraints bolted to the walls, ropes and chains stained with blood, and instruments of torture that had clearly been used to inflict maximum pain and suffering. The concrete floor bore dark stains that luminol tests confirmed were human blood, gallons of it, representing the final moments of dozens of young men who had died in agony in this underground hell. But the discoveries weren't limited to the basement. The backyard yielded additional graves, and investigators found remains buried under the garage, in the garden, and even beneath the dining room floor. Every inch of the property seemed to conceal evidence of Gacy's murderous activities. The house had literally been built on a foundation of human suffering. As news of the discoveries spread, Chicago was gripped by horror and disbelief. How had such systematic slaughter gone undetected for so long? How many more victims might there be? And most chillingly, how many other John Wayne Gacys might be living among them, hiding behind masks of respectability while carrying out acts of unthinkable evil? The identification of victims became a painstaking process that would take months to complete. Many of the remains were too decomposed to identify through conventional means, requiring dental records and other forensic techniques. One by one, the victims were given names and their families were notified. Each identification brought closure to grieving relatives who had spent years wondering what had happened to their missing sons, but it also revealed the full scope of the tragedy. John Butkovich was among the first victims to be identified, his remains found in the lime pit that had been his grave for nearly 2 years. Gregory Godzik, John Syc, Billy Carroll, and dozens of others followed young men whose lives had been cut short by a monster who viewed them as nothing more than objects to be used and discarded. Meanwhile, John Wayne Gacy sat in jail awaiting trial, finally stripped of the mask of respectability he had worn for so long. The friendly contractor, the community volunteer, the entertaining clown, all of these personas had been revealed as elaborate facades hiding something unspeakably evil. But even in custody, Gacy remained defiant, claiming he was the victim of a vast conspiracy designed to destroy him. His attempts to craft an insanity defense were as calculated and manipulative as everything else he had done. Gacy claimed to suffer from multiple personality disorder, insisting that his alternate personalities had carried out the murders while his normal self remained unaware. It was a pathetic attempt to escape responsibility for his crimes, and thankfully, the jury saw through his lies. The trial of John Wayne Gacy became a media sensation, drawing international attention to the quiet Chicago suburb where such horrors had unfolded. Prosecutors painted a picture of a calculating predator who had systematically hunted and killed young men for nearly a decade. They presented evidence of premeditation, of careful planning, and of a defendant who was fully aware of his actions throughout his killing spree. Defense attorneys tried desperately to save their client's life, arguing that years of childhood abuse had created a damaged individual who couldn't control his actions. They brought in psychiatrists who testified about Gacy's troubled past, his father's violence, and the psychological trauma that had shaped his development. But the prosecution countered with evidence of Gacy's ability to function normally in society, his success in business, and his calculated methods of victim selection and disposal. The most damning evidence came from Gacy himself. Tape recordings of his confessions revealed a man who spoke about murder with the same casual tone others might use to discuss the weather. He described his victims in dehumanizing terms, referring to them as objects or worthless male prostitutes who deserved their fate. There was no remorse, no empathy, no recognition that he had destroyed dozens of lives and devastated countless families. They were asking for it, Gacy told investigators with chilling matter-of-factness. They came to my house willingly. They knew what they were getting into. These statements revealed the depth of his delusion and his complete inability to accept responsibility for his actions. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty on all 33 counts of murder. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming evidence against Gacy and their revulsion at the crimes he had committed. During the penalty phase, they recommended death, a sentence that seemed appropriate for someone who had shown no mercy to his own victims. The years following his conviction saw Gacy attempt numerous appeals, each one failing as courts reviewed the evidence and confirmed the appropriateness of his death sentence. He spent 14 years on death row, during which time he gave interviews, wrote letters, and even took up painting, creating disturbing artwork that often featured clowns and other circus themes. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Gacy's time in prison was his continued lack of remorse. He never expressed genuine sorrow for his victims or their families, never acknowledged the full scope of his crimes, and never provided information that might have helped identify additional victims or provide closure to grieving families. To the end, he remained the same selfish, manipulative predator he had always been. On May 10, 1994, at 12:58 a.m., John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center. His final words were chillingly unrepentant: "Kiss my ass." Even in death, he refused to show remorse for the 33 lives he had brutally ended or acknowledge the immeasurable pain he had caused their families. But death could not undo the legacy of terror Gacy had created. The house at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue was demolished in 1979, yet the horror of what had transpired there continues to haunt the collective memory. The crawl space that had served as a tomb for 26 young men became a symbol of evil that lurked beneath the surface of suburban normalcy. The investigation also revealed victims whose bodies were never found. Gacy admitted to disposing of at least 5 victims in rivers, their remains lost forever to the murky waters around Chicago. These nameless victims represent the most tragic aspect of Gacy's crimes: young men who died in terror and whose families will never have closure, never know what happened to their sons and brothers. Robert Pius' body was eventually recovered from the Des Plaines River in April 1979, 4 months after his disappearance. The 15-year-old's dreams of becoming a pharmacist had been snuffed out by a monster who saw him as nothing more than another victim to satisfy his bloodlust. But Robert's death was not in vain. His disappearance had triggered the investigation that finally brought Gacy's reign of terror to an end. The psychological profile that emerged during the investigation painted a picture of a predator who had perfected the art of deception. Gacy's ability to maintain multiple personas simultaneously, the successful businessman, the community volunteer, the entertaining clown, allowed him to operate undetected for years. He understood that the best hiding place for a monster was often in plain sight, surrounded by the very people he preyed upon. The case also highlighted the tragic vulnerability of society's forgotten youth. Many of Gacy's victims were runaways, drifters, or young men estranged from their families, individuals whose disappearances generated little immediate concern from authorities. This tragedy led to changes in how missing person cases are handled, particularly those involving vulnerable populations. The killer clown's reign of terror had finally ended, but the scars he left on Chicago and the world would never fully heal. 33 families had lost sons, brothers, and friends to a monster who viewed human life as worthless. The house on Somerdale Avenue may have been demolished, but the memory of what happened there serves as a permanent reminder that evil can hide behind the most innocent of masks. John Wayne Gacy died as he had lived, without remorse, without empathy, and without any recognition of the humanity he had destroyed. But his victims live on in the memories of those who loved them, and their stories serve as a warning that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most normal, most trustworthy, most human. The case of John Wayne Gacy stands as one of the most horrific examples of serial murder in American history, a testament to the depths of depravity that can lurk within the human soul. His victims deserve justice, and though it came too late to save them, their deaths ultimately prevented countless others from suffering the same fate. In the end, that may be the only redemption to be found in this tale of unimaginable horror. The killer clown's painted smile had finally been wiped away forever, but the nightmares he created continue to haunt us all. For in the case of John Wayne Gacy, we learned that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not the ones hiding in the shadows. They are the ones hiding behind the brightest smiles, the most respectable facades, and the most innocent of masks. And that, perhaps, is the most chilling lesson of all. Story 2. Ed Gein, 1950s, 1960s. In the frostbitten darkness of rural Wisconsin, where winter winds howl through barren fields like the screams of the damned, a nightmare walked among the living. His name was Edward Theodore Gein, a name that would become synonymous with unthinkable horror, a man whose twisted mind would birth the most chilling chapter in American criminal history. Behind the facade of a quiet, awkward farmer lurked a monster so depraved, so utterly consumed by madness, that his crimes would inspire generations of horror films and haunt the collective nightmares of a nation. This is the story of bodies mutilated beyond recognition, of human skin fashioned into grotesque trophies, and of a house of horrors where the line between the living and the dead was obliterated in the most horrifying ways imaginable. Prepare yourself for a descent into madness so complete, so terrifyingly real, that you may never feel safe in the darkness again. The bitter Wisconsin winter of 1957 stretched across Plainfield like a death shroud, its icy fingers creeping through every crack and crevice of the small farming community. Snow fell in heavy, suffocating blankets, muffling the world in an eerie silence that seemed to press down on the soul itself. It was in this desolate landscape that evil had taken root, growing like a cancer in the shadows of isolation and twisted devotion. Edward Theodore Gein had been shaped by forces as cold and unforgiving as the Wisconsin winters themselves. Born August 27, 1906, into a world where cruelty masqueraded as discipline and religious fervor bordered on fanaticism, Ed's childhood was a masterclass in psychological torture. His mother, Augusta Wilhelmine Gein, was a woman whose iron will had been forged in the fires of religious extremism and whose love came wrapped in barbed wire. Augusta ruled her household with the terrifying conviction of a zealot. She saw sin everywhere, in the laughter of children, in the natural desires of men, in the very existence of women who dared to exist outside her narrow definition of purity. Her voice, when raised in righteous fury, could freeze blood in winter veins. She would gather her two sons, Ed and his older brother Henry, for hours of biblical recitation, her eyes burning with the fervor of someone who believed herself to be God's chosen instrument of judgment. The Gain farmhouse stood like a monument to madness on the outskirts of Plainfield, its weathered boards gray as tombstones, its windows staring out at the world like dead eyes. Inside, Augusta had created her own twisted kingdom where normal human interaction was forbidden, where any display of natural emotion was met with swift and brutal punishment. She preached that all women, save herself, were instruments of the devil, vessels of corruption designed to lead men astray from the righteous path. Ed absorbed these teachings like a sponge soaks up blood. His developing mind, already fragile and malleable, twisted these lessons into something far more sinister than even Augusta could have imagined. As he grew, his fascination with death began to manifest in increasingly disturbing ways. He would spend hours in the local cemetery, wandering among the weathered headstones, his fingers tracing the names of the dead with an intimacy that made observers deeply uncomfortable. The first signs of Ed's true nature emerged in adolescence, subtle at first, like cracks in ice before the devastating break. He began collecting roadkill, telling anyone who asked that he was studying anatomy. But those who glimpsed him at work saw something that chilled them to the bone. The gentle, almost loving way he handled the decomposing flesh, the strange smile that played across his lips as he examined the internal structures of death. Augusta's grip on her sons grew tighter with each passing year, her paranoia and religious mania reaching new heights of intensity. She forbade them from having friends, from dating, from any normal social interaction. The outside world, she declared, was a cesspool of sin and corruption, and only within the walls of their isolated farmhouse could true purity be maintained. Her sons were to be her knights, her protectors, her eternal companions in this war against the forces of darkness. But even Augusta couldn't control the natural progression of life and death. In 1940, her husband George died, leaving her alone with her two adult sons. Rather than mourning, Augusta seemed to view this as a divine sign that her mission was becoming more urgent. She increased her religious instruction, her voice growing more shrill and desperate with each passing day. Henry, Ed's older brother, began to show signs of rebellion. He started questioning their mother's teachings, suggesting that perhaps her views were extreme, even unhealthy. These quiet rebellions sent Augusta into towering rages that shook the very foundations of the farmhouse. She would lock herself in her room for hours, emerging with red-rimmed eyes and new pronouncements about the coming apocalypse. Ed watched these confrontations with growing unease. His brother's defiance terrified him more than his mother's rage. Henry represented a threat to the only world Ed had ever known, a world where Augusta's word was law and her love was the only love that mattered. The thought of losing that love, of being abandoned to face the cruel world alone, filled Ed with a panic so profound it made his hands shake and his vision blur. The tension in the household reached a breaking point in May 1944. Henry had been growing more vocal in his criticism of Augusta's control, more insistent that they needed to live their own lives. On May 16th, the two brothers went to burn brush on a marshy area of their property. The work was backbreaking, the smoke thick and choking, but it was necessary to clear the land for farming. As the sun began to set, painting the sky the color of dried blood, something happened in those remote marshlands that would change the course of Ed's life forever. The official story was that the brothers became separated in the smoke, that Henry had succumbed to asphyxiation while Ed, somehow, miraculously survived. But the truth was far more sinister. Ed would later claim that he couldn't remember exactly what happened, that the smoke and confusion had clouded his memory. But witnesses noted inconsistencies in his story. How had he been able to lead searchers directly to Henry's body if he had been lost? Why were there suspicious bruises on Henry's head if he had simply suffocated? And why did Ed seem so strangely calm, so eerily composed, when discussing his brother's death. The local sheriff, a man named Art Schley who would later play a crucial role in Ed's downfall, harbored suspicions but could prove nothing. In rural Wisconsin, accidents happened. Brothers died in fires, in farming mishaps, in the countless ways that claimed lives in agricultural communities. But something about Ed's demeanor, something about the way he spoke of Henry's death with such detached calm, sent chills down Schley's spine. With Henry gone, Ed's world contracted even further. He became Augusta's sole companion, her devoted acolyte, her willing prisoner. She was nearing 70 now, her health failing, but her iron will remained unbroken. If anything, Henry's death had convinced her that Ed was her chosen one, the son who would remain faithful to her teachings until the very end. But Augusta's end came sooner than expected. In December 1945, she suffered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed and dependent on Ed's care. For months, he nursed her with a devotion that bordered on worship, feeding her, bathing her, reading to her from the Bible. To Ed, Augusta wasn't just his mother. She was his God, his universe, his reason for existing. When the second, fatal stroke came in December 1945, Ed's world didn't just change. It shattered completely. The woman who had been the center of his existence, the source of all meaning and purpose, was gone. The farmhouse, once filled with Augusta's commanding presence, now echoed with a silence so profound it seemed to have weight. Ed stood over his mother's body, his hands trembling, his mind struggling to process the reality of her absence. She looked smaller in death, more fragile than the towering figure who had dominated his life. But even in death, Augusta's influence remained absolute. Her voice still echoed in his head. Her teachings still guided his every thought. The funeral was a small affair. Augusta had few friends. Her abrasive personality and extreme views had alienated most of the community. But those who attended noticed something disturbing about Ed's behavior. He seemed almost euphoric, his eyes bright with an unsettling intensity. When people offered condolences, he would smile and nod, but there was something hollow about his responses, something that suggested his mind was somewhere else entirely. After the funeral, Ed returned to the farmhouse alone for the first time in his life. The silence was deafening. Every room held memories of Augusta. Her chair by the window, her Bible on the kitchen table, her clothes hanging in the closet like empty shells of a life now extinguished. But rather than cleaning out these reminders of his loss, Ed did something that would have chilled the blood of anyone who witnessed it. He sealed off the rooms Augusta had used most, her bedroom, the parlor where she held her religious instruction sessions, the dining room where they had shared countless meals. These spaces, he declared, were to remain exactly as she had left them, shrines to her memory that would preserve her presence in the world of the living. The rest of the house, however, began to change in ways that reflected the twisted landscape of Ed's deteriorating mind. Without Augusta's rigid structure and constant supervision, the darkness that had always lurked within him began to emerge. He stopped maintaining the basic cleanliness of the home, allowing dishes to pile up, garbage to accumulate, and a general atmosphere of decay to settle over everything. But it was in the basement and outbuildings where Ed's true nature began to manifest. He converted these spaces into workshops where he could pursue his growing fascination with death and anatomy. What had begun as a childhood interest in roadkill evolved into something far more sinister, a compulsion to understand the mechanics of death, to explore the boundary between life and decay. The local cemetery became Ed's frequent destination. He would arrive after dark, when the shadows were deepest and the chances of being observed were minimal. At first, his activities were relatively harmless. He would simply sit by graves, talking to the dead as if they could hear him, sharing news of the living world with those who had departed. But as the months passed, Ed's midnight visits became more elaborate, more disturbing. He began bringing tools, shovels, crowbars, implements that had no business in a cemetery after dark. The night sounds of digging would occasionally drift across the countryside, but in a farming community where people often worked unusual hours, no one thought to investigate. Ed had discovered that death held secrets, mysteries that could only be unlocked through direct examination. The bodies in the cemetery, preserved by the cold Wisconsin soil and the chemicals used by local undertakers, offered him opportunities to study human anatomy in ways that no textbook could provide. But this clinical curiosity quickly evolved into something far more personal, more intimate. He found himself drawn to the bodies of middle-aged women, particularly those who reminded him of Augusta. There was something profoundly disturbing about the way he handled these corpses, something that went beyond mere scientific interest. He would spend hours with them, talking to them, treating them with a gentleness that had been absent from most of his interactions with the living. The pattern that would define Ed Gein's crimes was already taking shape. Death fascinated him not as an ending, but as a transformation. The dead, he discovered, could be more compliant than the living, more willing to listen, more accepting of his attention. In his twisted mind, the boundary between life and death began to blur, creating a worldview where the deceased could serve purposes that the living never could. By 1947, Ed had established routines that would have horrified anyone who suspected their true nature. His nocturnal visits to the cemetery had become regular pilgrimages, expeditions that yielded materials for his increasingly elaborate experiments. The farmhouse basement became a laboratory where the normal rules of human decency were suspended, where Ed could explore his darkest impulses without fear of judgment or interruption. The isolation that Augusta had imposed on her family now served Ed's purposes perfectly. The nearest neighbors were miles away, separated by fields and forests that muffled sound and obscured vision. No one came to visit the Gein property anymore. Augusta's death had severed the few social connections the family had maintained. This isolation allowed Ed's madness to flourish unchecked. Without the constraints of social interaction, without the need to maintain a normal facade, he could dedicate himself entirely to his growing obsession with death and decay. The man who had once been merely strange and withdrawn was transforming into something far more sinister, a predator whose appetite for horror was just beginning to manifest. The seeds that Augusta had planted with her twisted teachings were finally beginning to bear their terrible fruit. Her son, the quiet farmer who had seemed harmless to his neighbors, was evolving into something that would haunt their nightmares and challenge their understanding of human evil. The stage was set for crimes so shocking, so utterly depraved, that they would redefine the very concept of horror in the American consciousness. As 1947 turned to 1948, Ed Gein stood at the threshold of becoming one of history's most notorious killers. The transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible to outside observers, but inexorable in its progression. The man was disappearing, consumed from within by forces he could no longer control, replaced by something that wore his face but harbored appetites that belonged in the darkest corners of human imagination. The killing would begin soon. The autumn of 1954 arrived in Plainfield with an air of foreboding that seemed to seep from the very ground itself. The leaves turned early that year, their vibrant reds and golds quickly fading to the color of dried blood and old bones. There was something unsettling in the way the wind moved through the bare branches, a whispering sound that made even the bravest souls hurry past the Gein farmhouse after dark. Ed Gein had spent the past 9 years since his mother's death cultivating his macabre interests in the shadows of respectability. To his neighbors, he remained the quiet, awkward man who occasionally came to town for supplies, who kept to himself and bothered no one. They saw his nervous smile, his deferential manner, his apparent harmlessness. What they couldn't see was the transformation taking place within the walls of that isolated farmhouse, where Ed's fascination with death had evolved into something far more sinister. The basement of the Gein property had become a charnel house of unimaginable proportions. Shelves lined the walls, displaying Ed's growing collection of specimens. Human skulls that had been carefully cleaned and polished, bones that had been sorted and cataloged with the precision of a museum curator, and organs preserved in jars of formaldehyde that Ed had acquired through connections at the local mortuary. The smell that permeated these spaces was indescribable, a mixture of decay, chemicals, and something else that defied identification, something that seemed to emanate from Ed's very soul. But grave robbing, as disturbing as it was, no longer satisfied Ed's deepening hunger for intimacy with death. The corpses he exhumed were cold, unresponsive, already beginning their journey back to dust. What Ed craved was something more immediate, more personal, the moment of transformation from life to death, the precise instant when breath stopped and the spark of consciousness flickered out forever. The opportunity came on a gray November afternoon when Bernice Wardens, the local hardware store owner, found herself alone in her shop as closing time approached. Bernice was a formidable woman in her late 50s, known throughout Plainfield for her sharp business acumen and no-nonsense attitude. She had inherited the store from her late husband and ran it with an efficiency that impressed even her male competitors. Strong-willed and independent, she represented everything Augusta Gain had taught her son to fear and despise about women who dared to exist outside male control. Ed had been watching Bernice for months, studying her routines with the patience of a predator. He knew that she usually closed the store alone on Saturdays, that her son Frank was often away hunting, and that the hardware store's location at the edge of town provided the privacy he would need. But it wasn't just opportunity that drew Ed to Bernice. It was something deeper, more twisted. In her stern demeanor and authoritative presence, he saw echoes of Augusta, and that resemblance both terrified and excited him in ways he couldn't fully understand. On November 16, 1957, Ed entered Warden's hardware store just as Bernice was preparing to close. The afternoon light was already fading, casting long shadows across the cluttered interior of the shop. Bernice looked up from her ledger as the bell above the door chimed, her expression neutral but alert. She had always found Ed Gain to be slightly unsettling, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly why. There was something in his eyes, something hungry and desperate that made her unconsciously step back whenever he approached. "Afternoon, Ed," she said, her voice steady despite the unease that had settled in her stomach like a cold stone. "What can I do for you today?" Ed's response was barely above a whisper, his words so soft that Bernice had to lean forward to hear them. That was the mistake that would cost her everything. As she moved closer, Ed's hand moved with a speed and violence that shocked even him. The antifreeze can he had been pretending to examine became a weapon, swinging through the air with devastating force. The sound of metal connecting with flesh and bone was sickening, a wet crack that seemed to echo through the store for an eternity. Bernice's eyes widened in shock and pain, her mouth opening in a scream that would never come. Blood began to flow from the wound on her head, dark red rivulets that stained her gray hair and splattered across the wooden floor she had swept clean just hours before. But Bernice Wardens was not a woman who went down easily. Even stunned and bleeding, she fought back with a ferocity that caught Ed off guard. Her fingernails raked across his face, leaving deep scratches that would serve as evidence of her struggle. She tried to reach the shotgun she kept behind the counter, her fingers grasping desperately for the weapon that might save her life. Ed, however, was beyond rational thought now. The first taste of violence had awakened something primal within him, something that had been sleeping since the day he had killed his brother Henry in those smoky marshlands 13 years earlier. He struck again, and again, each blow more vicious than the last, until Bernice's movements became sluggish, then still. Standing over her motionless form, Ed felt a rush of emotions so intense they threatened to overwhelm him. There was satisfaction, yes, but also something deeper, a sense of completion, as if he had finally fulfilled some cosmic purpose that had been written into his very DNA. Bernice's blood was warm on his hands, her body still radiating the heat of life even as that life ebbed away. This was what he had been seeking all those years in the cold earth of the cemetery, the precise moment of transition, the sacred instant when life transformed into death. But Ed's work was far from finished. With Bernice's body growing cold at his feet, he began to implement plans that he had been formulating for months. First, he dragged her corpse to the back of the store, his movements efficient and practiced. He had learned much about handling dead weight during his years of grave robbing, and Bernice's body, though substantial, posed no significant challenge. The next step was to load her into his truck, a process that required both strength and cunning. Ed had to ensure that no one saw him transferring his grisly cargo, that no witnesses remained to connect him to Bernice's disappearance. The gathering darkness worked in his favor, providing cover for activities that would have horrified any observer. As he drove back to the farmhouse with Bernice's body secured in the truck bed, Ed felt a euphoria unlike anything he had ever experienced. The landscape that had always seemed so desolate and threatening now appeared welcoming, almost nurturing. The bare trees seemed to nod their approval, and the wind through the grass sounded like whispered encouragements. He was finally becoming what Augusta had unknowingly created, a force of nature, an agent of transformation who could bridge the gap between life and death. The farmhouse basement became the scene of horrors that defied human comprehension. Ed had learned much about anatomy from his years of studying corpses, and he applied this knowledge with a precision that would have impressed medical students. But his purposes were not scientific, they were deeply, disturbingly personal. He began by stringing Bernice's body up by the ankles, a process that required both physical strength and mechanical ingenuity. The rope bit deeply into her flesh, leaving marks that would later help investigators understand the systematic nature of Ed's crimes. The position allowed gravity to assist in the blood drainage, a detail that demonstrated Ed's growing expertise in post-mortem manipulation. What followed was a process so methodical, so coldly efficient, that it suggested years of practice and refinement. Ed removed Bernice's internal organs with surgical precision, setting aside the heart, liver, and kidneys in separate containers. He had developed his own preservation techniques, methods that combined traditional butchering practices with embalming procedures he had learned from his nocturnal visits to the local mortuary. But it was what Ed did with Bernice's skin that revealed the true depths of his madness. Using tools he had crafted specifically for this purpose, razor-sharp knives with handles wrapped in cloth for better grip, specialized cutting implements designed to separate skin from muscle without tearing, he began the painstaking process of complete removal. The skin came away in large, intact sections, pieces that Ed handled with an almost reverent care. This wasn't random mutilation. It was purposeful harvesting, conducted with an attention to detail that spoke to both Ed's growing skill and his complete detachment from normal human emotion. As he worked, he hummed to himself old hymns that Augusta had taught him, their melodies providing a soundtrack to activities that would have made the devil himself recoil in horror. Each piece of skin was carefully cleaned, treated with chemicals to prevent decomposition, and prepared for its ultimate purpose. Ed had plans for these materials, visions that had been growing in his mind for years. Bernice Wardens was not just his victim. She was his raw material, the foundation for projects that existed in the twisted landscape of his imagination. The skull received special attention. Ed had become expert at cleaning bone, removing every trace of flesh and tissue until only the perfect, gleaming structure remained. Bernice's skull would join the others in his collection, but it would hold a place of honor as his first fresh specimen, his initial foray into what he saw as a higher form of art. Throughout the night, Ed worked with the focused intensity of a craftsman, his movements growing more confident as the familiar rhythms of dismemberment took hold. There was no hesitation now, no uncertainty, only the smooth, practiced motions of someone who had found their true calling. The basement filled with the sounds of cutting and sawing, punctuated by Ed's occasional humming and the drip of blood onto the concrete floor. As dawn approached, Ed surveyed his work with satisfaction. What had once been Bernice Warden's, respected businesswoman and pillar of the community, had been transformed into something else entirely, components in Ed's expanding collection of human materials. Her identity, her personality, her decades of life and experience had been reduced to carefully cataloged body parts, each with its own designated purpose in Ed's grand design. The cleanup was methodical and thorough. Ed had learned from his earlier experiments that blood was notoriously difficult to remove completely, that even microscopic traces could betray the most careful criminal. He used bleach, ammonia, and other cleaning agents with the thoroughness of a professional crime scene cleaner, scrubbing every surface until it gleamed. The remaining evidence, the parts of Bernice that held no interest for Ed's purposes, required disposal. He had prepared for this eventuality, having dug a series of deep pits in the woods behind his property. These graves would never be marked, never be mourned over, never be discovered. They represented the final insult to his victim's dignity, anonymous disappearance into the Wisconsin soil. As the sun rose over Plainfield, Ed Gaines stood in his basement, surrounded by the fruits of his labor. The transformation was complete. Not just Bernice's transformation from living woman to raw material, but Ed's own metamorphosis from mere grave robber to active killer. The threshold had been crossed, and there could be no turning back. The rush of achievement, the satisfaction of a job well done, filled Ed with an energy that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. He had discovered his true purpose, his reason for existence. The years of preparation, the countless nights spent perfecting his techniques on corpses stolen from graves, had all led to this moment of triumph. But even as Ed basked in the afterglow of his successful hunt, he was already planning the next kill. Bernice Wardens had been perfect in many ways, isolated, predictable, physically manageable, but she had also presented certain challenges. Next time, he would be even more prepared, even more careful, even more efficient. The monster that Augusta Gain had inadvertently created was fully awakened now, and its appetite was insatiable. Plainfield, with its trusting residents and sparse law enforcement, provided a hunting ground rich with potential victims. Ed could see them in his mind's eye, the women who reminded him of Augusta, who carried themselves with the same authority, the same independence that both fascinated and enraged him. As he climbed the stairs from his basement workshop, Ed was already considering his options. There was Mary Hogan, who ran the tavern in nearby Pine Grove, another strong woman who dared to exist outside male control. There were others too, women whose independence made them targets in Ed's twisted worldview, whose very existence challenged the lessons Augusta had drilled into him throughout his childhood. The killing had begun in earnest now, and Ed Gain had discovered that he had a talent for it. The next victim was already in his sights, and the next chapter in his reign of terror was about to unfold. The disappearance of Bernice Wardens sent shockwaves through the small community of Plainfield that reverberated like the tolling of funeral bells. For 3 days, search parties scoured the countryside, their voices calling her name into the wind until their throats were raw with shouting. Sheriff Art Schley organized the search with military precision, but a growing dread settled in his stomach like ice water. He had seen Ed Gain's name on the last sales receipt in Bernice's store, and something about that discovery filled him with a foreboding that went beyond professional intuition. Meanwhile, Ed Gain went about his daily routine with an unsettling normalcy that fooled those who didn't look too closely. He joined the search parties, his face appropriately grave with concern, his voice joining the chorus calling for Bernice. But those who observed him carefully noticed troubling inconsistencies. The way his eyes would brighten when talk turned to where the body might be found, the strange smile that played at the corners of his mouth when no one was looking directly at him. What the searchers couldn't have known was that their quarry was closer than they imagined. Bernice Warden's remains had been carefully processed and integrated into Ed's growing collection, her identity erased and replaced with the cold functionality of organized specimens. In Ed's twisted mind, he had not destroyed Bernice. He had preserved her, given her a form of immortality that transcended the temporary nature of human life. But Bernice Wardens was not Ed's first victim, merely his first official murder. The truth was far more horrifying, a blood-soaked timeline that stretched back further than anyone suspected. Mary Hogan had been the true beginning, the tentative first step in Ed's journey from grave robber to active predator. Mary Hogan's Tavern in Pine Grove had been a local institution for decades. The Hogan Tavern was more than just a place to drink. It was a social hub where farmers gathered to discuss crops and weather, where travelers stopped for hot meals and cold beer, where the loneliness of rural life could be temporarily forgotten in the warmth of human company. Mary herself was the heart of this establishment, a woman in her early 50s with graying hair and laugh lines that spoke of decades spent listening to other people's troubles. But it was Mary's independence that marked her for death in Ed Gain's diseased mind. She owned her business, made her own decisions, and answered to no man. In Ed's world, shaped by Augusta's fanatical teachings, such women were abominations, living violations of the natural order that demanded correction. Mary Hogan had committed the unforgivable sin of existing on her own terms, and for that, she would pay the ultimate price. December 8, 1954, had been a typical winter evening at the Hogan Tavern. Snow fell steadily outside, muffling the world in white silence, while inside, The warmth of the wood stove created a cozy atmosphere that drew customers like moths to flame. Mary worked behind the bar with practiced efficiency, her movements graceful despite her age, her conversation easy and natural with the regulars who considered her tavern a second home. As the evening wore on, the crowd began to thin. The farmers had early mornings ahead of them, the traveling salesmen needed to reach their next destinations, and gradually the tavern emptied until only Mary remained, cleaning glasses and wiping down tables in preparation for closing. The silence that settled over the establishment was comfortable, familiar, the peaceful end to another successful day. Ed Gain entered through the back door just as Mary was counting the day's receipts. He had been watching the tavern for weeks, studying the patterns of customers and staff, learning the routines that would allow him to strike without witnesses. The back entrance was sheltered from view by a storage shed, and the falling snow would muffle any sounds that might carry to neighboring buildings. Mary looked up from her counting as Ed appeared in the doorway, his slight frame silhouetted against the swirling snow. Something in his posture, something in the way he held himself, sent alarm bells ringing in her subconscious. Mary Hogan had been serving alcohol to men for decades, and she had developed an instinct for detecting danger that had kept her safe through countless potentially volatile situations. "We're closed, Ed," she said, her voice steady but firm. "Come back tomorrow if you need something." Ed's response was a smile that never reached his eyes, an expression so devoid of genuine warmth that it seemed to leach heat from the room itself. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with deliberate care, and Mary's hand instinctively moved toward the baseball bat she kept beneath the bar counter. "I'm not here for a drink, Mary," Ed said, his voice carrying an odd, sing-song quality that made Mary's skin crawl. "I'm here for something else entirely." The attack came without warning, an explosion of violence that shattered the peaceful atmosphere like a grenade in a cathedral. Ed moved with a speed and ferocity that belied his scrawny appearance, the months of planning and anticipation finally releasing in a torrent of pure aggression. The weapon was a .32 caliber pistol that Ed had acquired through means that would never be fully explained, a tool that allowed him to kill from a distance while minimizing the physical struggle that had made Bernice Warden's death so challenging. The first shot caught Mary in the head, the bullet tearing through her skull and ending her life in an instant. The sound of the gunshot seemed impossibly loud in the confined space of the tavern, a thunderclap that should have brought running feet and shouted questions. But the storm outside provided cover, and Pine Grove was small enough that the nearest neighbors were too far away to hear anything amiss. Mary's body crumpled behind the bar, her blood spreading across the worn wooden floor in dark rivulets that seemed to follow the grain of the wood like some macabre decorative pattern. Ed stood over her for long moments, drinking in the sight of his handiwork, savoring the transition from planning to execution that marked another milestone in his evolution as a killer. But unlike the frenzied improvisation that had characterized Bernice Warden's murder, Mary Hogan's death had been carefully orchestrated from beginning to end. Ed had prepared for this moment with the thoroughness of a general planning a military campaign, and every step of the aftermath had been meticulously arranged. He dragged Mary's body to his truck with practiced efficiency, the months of grave robbing having taught him the most effective methods for moving dead weight without leaving obvious signs of disturbance. The blood on the tavern floor was cleaned with bleach and ammonia, the spent shell casing retrieved and pocketed, any evidence of his presence systematically eliminated. The drive back to the farmhouse through the snowstorm provided perfect cover for Ed's activities. The falling snow would obscure any tire tracks, the storm would keep potential witnesses indoors, and the isolation of his property ensured that his work could proceed without interruption. Mary Hogan was about to become the first victim in what Ed was beginning to think of as his true calling, the transformation of human beings into something more useful, more permanent. The basement that had served as Ed's laboratory and workshop became Mary Hogan's final destination, though what happened there defied every concept of dignity and respect that civilized society holds sacred. Ed's techniques had been refined through years of practice on corpses stolen from graves, but working with a fresh body presented new opportunities and challenges that he approached with the enthusiasm of a craftsman discovering new materials. The dismemberment was methodical and complete, each cut planned to maximize the usability of the resulting components. Ed had developed his own system of organization, categorizing body parts by function and potential application, storing them in containers that he had modified specifically for long-term preservation. Mary Hogan's head was removed and prepared with special care. Ed had plans for it that went beyond mere collection. The skin was harvested with particular attention to maintaining large, intact sections. Ed had been experimenting with tanning processes that he had learned from library books on leatherworking, adapting traditional techniques to work with human materials. The results were disturbing beyond description. Sheets of human skin processed until they had the consistency and durability of fine leather, materials that could be sewn and shaped into forms limited only by Ed's imagination. Mary's internal organs were preserved in jars of formaldehyde, each carefully labeled and dated like specimens in a medical school laboratory. But Ed's interests went beyond mere preservation. He was beginning to experiment with ways to make use of these materials, to integrate them into his daily life in ways that brought him closer to the essence of death that fascinated him so completely. The bones were cleaned and sorted with obsessive precision, each piece cataloged and stored in specially constructed cabinets that Ed had built in the basement's deepest corners. These skeletal remains would form the foundation for projects that existed only in Ed's twisted imagination, constructions that blurred the line between art and atrocity. As winter gave way to spring, and spring to summer, Ed refined his techniques with each new acquisition from the local cemetery. But the thrill of grave robbing was diminishing, no longer providing the satisfaction that fresh kills delivered. The preserved corpses lacked the vitality, the warmth, the struggling life force that made murder so intoxicating. Mary Hogan's disappearance had been handled with the same efficiency as her murder. Ed had spread a story about seeing a car with Illinois license plates outside the tavern on the night she vanished, suggesting that she might have left town with a traveling salesman. The story was plausible enough to satisfy most of the community's curiosity, and the investigation eventually stalled for lack of evidence. But Ed's growing confidence was leading him to take increasingly dangerous risks. He began making mistakes, small ones at first, but errors that would eventually form a pattern visible to those trained to look for such things. Sheriff Art Schley was one such observer, and Ed's behavior during the search for Bernice Wardens had triggered every instinct the lawman possessed. The most horrifying aspect of Ed's crimes wasn't just the killing. It was what he did with the bodies afterward. The farmhouse had been transformed into a monument to death, a museum of human remains that existed in defiance of every moral and ethical principle that governed civilized behavior. The sealed rooms that honored Augusta's memory served as a bizarre counterpoint to the basement workshops where her son pursued his ghoulish hobbies. Ed had begun fashioning items from his victims' remains with a creativity that was as impressive as it was revolting. Mary Hogan's skull had been converted into a soup bowl, carefully cleaned and polished until it gleamed like expensive china. Her scalp, with its graying hair still attached, had been fashioned into a crude wig that Ed would sometimes wear while performing household chores, the dead woman's hair framing his face in a grotesque parody of femininity. The skin from both Mary and Bernice had been sewn together to create garments that Ed wore in the privacy of his home. Vests made from human torsos, complete with nipples and navels still intact, masks crafted from facial skin that allowed him to literally wear the faces of his victims. These weren't random acts of mutilation. They were purposeful creations born from a mind that had completely severed its connection to normal human emotion and empathy. Ed's collection expanded to include items that revealed the full extent of his depravity. He crafted lampshades from human skin stretched over wire frames, the translucent quality of the processed flesh creating an eerie glow when illuminated from within. Chair seats were upholstered with patches of skin taken from his victims' thighs and backs, creating furniture that was both functional and horrifying. The most disturbing creations were the decorative items that Ed scattered throughout his living spaces. Human skulls served as bookends in his makeshift library, their empty eye sockets staring blindly at volumes on anatomy and embalming techniques. Finger bones had been fashioned into wind chimes that created haunting melodies when disturbed by air currents from the furnace. But perhaps most chilling of all were the soup bowls Ed had crafted from the tops of human skulls, sawing away the craniums with meticulous care and polishing the bone until it shone like ivory. These weren't mere trophies. Ed actually used them for their intended purpose, eating his meals from containers made from the heads of women who had once walked, talked, and lived full lives in the Plainfield community. The basement workshop where these atrocities were created had evolved into a charnel house that would have impressed medieval torture masters. Workbenches were stained with blood that had soaked so deeply into the wood grain that no amount of scrubbing could remove it completely. Tools hung from pegboards with the orderliness of a professional butcher shop. Knives in various sizes, bone saws for different applications, awls and picks for detailed work on small bones and joints. Ed had constructed a crude but effective preservation system using chemicals he obtained from the local mortuary and medical supply companies. Formaldehyde, alcohol, and various salts were combined in solutions that could maintain human tissue for extended periods, allowing Ed to work at his own pace without concern for decomposition. The smell of these chemicals permeated every corner of the basement, creating an atmosphere that was equal parts laboratory and tomb. The organization of Ed's collection revealed a mind that, while clearly insane, retained enough functionality to categorize and catalog his gruesome inventory. Shelves lined the basement walls, each containing carefully labeled containers that held specific body parts sorted by type and condition. Hearts were kept separate from livers, which were distinct from kidneys, each organ preserved according to its individual requirements. Larger items, complete limbs, torsos, heads, were stored in specially constructed cabinets that Ed had built with the precision of a master carpenter. These storage units featured drainage systems to handle any fluid leakage, ventilation to prevent bacterial growth, and locks to ensure that his collection remained secure from potential discovery. As Ed's confidence grew, so did his ambitions. He began to envision projects that would require multiple victims, constructions that would push the boundaries of his twisted artistry into new realms of horror. He dreamed of creating a complete female suit from human skin, a garment that would allow him to literally become the women whose independence and authority had both fascinated and terrified him throughout his life. This vision consumed Ed's thoughts with increasing intensity. He would spend hours in his basement workshop, sketching designs and measuring existing materials, planning the construction of what he saw as his masterpiece. The suit would require skin from multiple sources, the face from one victim, the torso from another, arms and legs from still others, all sewn together with the skill of a master tailor. The psychological implications of this project revealed depths of madness that even trained psychiatrists would struggle to comprehend. Ed wasn't simply creating a disguise. He was attempting to construct a new identity, a way to literally inhabit the female form that represented both his deepest fear and his most powerful desire. Augusta's teachings about the evil nature of women had created a profound confusion in Ed's mind, a simultaneous attraction to and revulsion from femininity that could only be resolved through the complete possession of female victims. But Ed's grand project would require more materials than his current collection could provide. Mary Hogan and Bernice Wardens had been excellent sources, but their remains alone wouldn't be sufficient for the comprehensive suit he envisioned. More victims would be needed. More women would have to die to feed Ed's insatiable hunger for human materials. As autumn approached in 1957, Ed was already planning his next hunt. The success of his previous kills had given him confidence in his methods, and the lack of serious investigation into the disappearances had convinced him that he could continue his work without significant risk of discovery. The isolation of rural Wisconsin provided perfect cover for his activities, and the trusting nature of the local population made target selection relatively simple. But Ed's growing boldness was also making him careless. The mistakes he had made during Bernice Warden's murder, leaving his name on the sales receipt, being seen near the hardware store at the time of her disappearance, were symptoms of an overconfidence that would prove to be his downfall. Sheriff Art Schley was beginning to piece together a pattern that pointed directly at the quiet farmer who lived alone in that isolated farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The investigation that would ultimately expose Ed's crimes was already beginning to take shape, though its full scope wouldn't become apparent until the shocking discoveries that awaited law enforcement officers brave enough to enter the Gain property. What they would find there would challenge every assumption about human nature and redefine the concept of evil in ways that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The harvest of horror was nearing its end, but the most shocking revelations were yet to come. Ed Gain's House of Horrors was about to be exposed to the world, and the discoveries made there would ensure that his name would be remembered long after the victims he had so callously destroyed were forgotten by all but their families and friends. November 16, 1957, dawned gray and bitter across Plainfield, Wisconsin, with the kind of bone-deep cold that seemed to seep through skin and settle in the marrow. Sheriff Art Schley had spent a sleepless night wrestling with the evidence that pointed increasingly toward Ed Gain as the prime suspect in Bernice Worden's disappearance. The sales receipt with Ed's name, the witnesses who had seen him near the hardware store, and most disturbing of all, the strange, almost gleeful way Ed had participated in the search parties. All of it coalesced into a pattern that made Schley's stomach churn with dread. As morning broke, Schley assembled a small team of deputies, each man handpicked for his steadiness under pressure and his ability to handle whatever horrors they might encounter. None of them could have imagined the nightmare that awaited them at the Gain farmhouse. A discovery so shocking that it would haunt them until their dying days and forever change how America understood the depths of human depravity. The Gain property looked deceptively normal as the law enforcement vehicles approached through the morning mist. The weathered farmhouse sat in its cluster of outbuildings like countless others scattered across the Wisconsin countryside, its windows staring blankly at the approaching officers like dead eyes in a corpse's face. Nothing in its external appearance suggested the unspeakable horrors that lay within the carefully organized museum of human remains that Ed Gain had been curating for over a decade. Sheriff Schley knocked on the front door with a heavy fist, the sound echoing through the morning stillness like gunshots. When no answer came, he tried the handle and found it unlocked, a detail that should have been comforting in its suggestion of innocence, but instead felt ominous, as if they were being invited into a trap. The door swung open with a prolonged creak that seemed to go on forever, revealing the interior of the house that would soon become synonymous with nightmare itself. The smell hit them first, a nauseating mixture of decay, chemicals, and something else that defied identification but triggered every primitive alarm their brains possessed. It was the smell of death, not recent but ongoing, pervasive, soaked into the very walls and floorboards of the structure. Deputy Dan Chase, a man with 15 years of law enforcement experience, immediately began retching, his body's involuntary response to an odor that signaled danger at the most fundamental level. The first floor of the house appeared relatively normal, if somewhat neglected. Dust covered most surfaces, dishes were piled in the sink, and the general atmosphere was one of a bachelor's dwelling that hadn't seen proper cleaning in years. But there were details that began to unsettle the officers as they moved through the rooms. The way certain areas seemed sealed off with makeshift barriers, the strange stains on the floor that looked suspiciously like old bloodstains, and most disturbing of all, the decorative items that seemed somehow wrong even though their exact nature wasn't immediately apparent. It was Deputy Sheriff Art Schley who first noticed the peculiar qualities of some of Ed's household items. What appeared to be a wastepaper basket in the living room revealed itself, upon closer inspection, to be made from human skin stretched over a wire frame. The realization hit Schley like a physical blow, causing him to stagger backward and reach for his service weapon with trembling hands. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the oppressive silence of the house. What kind of monster are we dealing with here? The answer to that question lay in the basement, but first the officers had to steel themselves for a descent into what would prove to be one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history. The wooden stairs creaked ominously under their weight as they made their way down, their flashlight beams cutting through darkness that seemed almost solid in its intensity. The smell grew stronger with each step, evolving from merely nauseating to absolutely overwhelming. What they found in the basement defied every category of human experience. The space had been converted into what could only be described as a charnel house, a workshop dedicated to the processing and preservation of human remains. Workbenches were stained black with blood, their surfaces scarred by countless cuts from knives and saws. Tools hung from pegboards with the orderliness of a professional butcher shop, each implement designed for specific aspects of dismemberment and preservation. But it was the inventory that truly revealed the scope of Ed Gain's depravity. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, each containing carefully labeled containers that held human body parts in various states of preservation. Hearts floated in jars of formaldehyde like obscene museum specimens. Livers and kidneys were sorted by size and condition. Entire sections were devoted to bones, femurs, tibias, ribs, and skulls, all cleaned and polished until they gleamed like ivory. Deputy Chase discovered the first of what would prove to be numerous skulls that had been converted into bowls. Their tops sawed off with precision and the interior surfaces polished until they shone. The realization that these weren't just trophies but functional items that Ed had actually used for eating meals sent the deputy into another bout of violent retching that echoed through the basement like the cries of the damned. Sheriff Schlee's flashlight beam fell upon a workbench where Ed had been in the middle of a project when interrupted by Bernice Warden's unscheduled visit to his hardware store. Pieces of human skin were laid out like a tailor's pattern, marked with chalk lines that indicated where cuts should be made. Needles and threads suggested that these materials were being sewn together into some sort of garment, though the officers couldn't immediately comprehend the full horror of what Ed had been attempting to create. The discovery that sent even the most hardened officers fleeing toward the stairs was a complete female torso, carefully skinned and preserved, that had been fashioned into a vest. The nipples and navel were still intact, creating a grotesque parody of human anatomy that had been converted into a wearable garment. The implications of what this represented, that Ed had been literally wearing the skin of his victims, pushed several officers beyond their psychological breaking point. But the basement horrors were only the beginning. As the investigation expanded to include the outbuildings scattered around the property, each new discovery added another layer of revulsion to an already unthinkable crime scene. The old chicken coop had been converted into a secondary storage facility where larger items were kept, complete limbs, torsos, and other body parts that were too large for basement storage. It was in a shed behind the main house that officers made the discovery that would finally provide closure for the warden's family, while simultaneously opening new vistas of horror. Bernice Warden's body hung from the ceiling like a butchered deer, suspended by ropes attached to her ankles. Her head had been removed, her torso opened and emptied of internal organs, her body prepared for the same systematic processing that had been applied to Ed's previous victims. The sight of Bernice's corpse, still recognizable despite the mutilation, brought home the human cost of Ed's madness in a way that the anonymous body parts in the basement could not. This wasn't just evidence of murder. It was the systematic destruction of a human being, the reduction of a woman with decades of life experience, relationships, hopes, and dreams into nothing more than raw material for a madman's projects. Sheriff Schlee had to physically restrain Deputy Chase from attacking the corpse with his bare hands, not out of disrespect for the victim, but from a desperate need to somehow reverse what had been done, to restore dignity to remains that had been so thoroughly violated. The discovery scene became chaotic as officers struggled with emotions that their training had never prepared them to handle, reactions to sights that human beings were never meant to witness. As the investigation continued, the full scope of Ed's collection began to emerge. In addition to the items already discovered, officers found lampshades made from human faces, the features still recognizable enough to suggest that Ed had specifically chosen victims whose appearance pleased him in some twisted way. The skin had been processed until it was translucent, creating an eerie glow when light passed through it that transformed ordinary rooms into chambers of horror. Chair seats upholstered with human skin, the material stretched and tacked into place with the precision of a professional furniture maker. The implications that Ed had been sitting on these chairs, using furniture made from human beings, added another dimension of revulsion to an already incomprehensible crime scene. A shoebox containing 9 death masks, facial skin that had been carefully removed and preserved, creating eerily lifelike reproductions of Ed's victims' faces. These weren't random trophies, but carefully crafted mementos that suggested Ed revisited his crimes mentally, using these items to relive the experience of murder and mutilation. 10 female skulls that had been converted into bowls, each one sawed open with surgical precision and polished until the bone gleamed. Some still contained residue that suggested they had been used for their intended purpose. Ed had literally been eating meals from the skulls of women he had killed. A pair of lips attached to a window shade pull, creating a grotesque decoration that served no functional purpose other than to remind Ed of his victims every time he adjusted the light in his living room. The lips had been preserved with such skill that they retained much of their original color and texture. Fingernails that had been collected and stored in small jars, sorted by size and color like materials in a craft store. The implications of this collection, that Ed had carefully removed and preserved even the smallest parts of his victims, spoke to an obsessiveness that went far beyond mere murder into realms of compulsion that defied psychological explanation. A belt made from female nipples, strung together like decorative beads and worn around Ed's waist. The discovery of this item, hanging in his bedroom closet as if it were perfectly normal clothing, provided chilling evidence of how completely Ed had integrated his victims' remains into his daily life. As word of the discovery spread, Plainfield found itself at the center of a media firestorm that would make the small farming community synonymous with horror for generations to come. Reporters descended like vultures, their cameras and questions transforming the quiet streets into a circus of sensationalism that further traumatized a population already struggling to comprehend how such evil could have existed among them undetected for so long. The psychological impact on the officers who made these discoveries cannot be overstated. Sheriff Art Schley, a man who had served his community faithfully for decades, never fully recovered from what he witnessed in the Gain house. The images of mutilated bodies, human furniture, and Ed's grotesque collections would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life, eventually contributing to a breakdown that forced his early retirement from law enforcement. Deputy Dan Chase, who had been among the first to enter the basement charnel house, developed a drinking problem that destroyed his career and his marriage. The things he had seen in that basement workshop challenged every assumption he had held about human nature, forcing him to confront the reality that monsters walked among ordinary people, hiding their true nature behind masks of normalcy and social acceptability. The community of Plainfield itself struggled to process the revelation that one of their neighbors, a man they had known for decades, had been living a double life of unimaginable horror. Ed Gain had been a fixture in their community. Quiet, strange perhaps, but seemingly harmless. The realization that appearances could be so deceiving, that evil could hide so completely behind a facade of normalcy, shattered their sense of security in ways that would never fully heal. Local businesses reported a surge in sales of locks, security systems, and weapons as residents struggled to protect themselves from threats they couldn't identify or understand. The knowledge that Ed had lived among them undetected for years, that he had participated in community events and church services while secretly transforming his neighbors into furniture and clothing, created a paranoia that infected every aspect of daily life. The investigation revealed that Ed's crimes had gone undetected for so long partly because of his ability to maintain a convincing facade of normalcy. He had continued to attend church services, shop at local stores, and interact with his neighbors in ways that aroused no suspicion. This ability to compartmentalize his life, to function as a seemingly normal member of society while pursuing activities of unthinkable depravity, made him more terrifying than any rampaging monster could ever be. The final tally of Ed's collection included items made from at least 15 different human beings, though investigators suspected that the true number of victims was much higher. Many of the remains were too fragmentary or too processed to allow for individual identification, meaning that some of Ed's victims would remain forever anonymous, their identities lost along with their lives. The house itself became a macabre tourist attraction in the days following the discovery, with curiosity seekers traveling hundreds of miles to glimpse the building where such horrors had taken place. Local authorities eventually had to post guards to keep people away from the property, but the damage to Plainfield's reputation was already done. The community would forever be associated with Ed Gain's crimes, its name spoken in the same breath as some of history's worst serial killers. As Ed Gain was finally taken into custody, the full weight of his crimes began to settle on a nation that thought it understood the limits of human evil. The quiet farmer who had seemed so harmless, so utterly ordinary, had revealed himself to be something far worse than a simple murderer. He was an artist of atrocity, a craftsman who had transformed human beings into objects of utility and decoration with a skill that spoke to years of practice and refinement. The trial that would follow, the psychiatric evaluations that would attempt to understand the workings of Ed's mind, and the cultural impact that would make his name synonymous with horror, all of these were yet to come. But the discoveries made in that house of horrors on November 16, 1957, had already ensured that Ed Gain's legacy would be one of absolute evil, a reminder that monsters are real and that they sometimes live next door, hiding their true nature behind smiles and small talk until the moment comes to reveal their authentic selves. The nightmare was over, but its echoes would reverberate through American culture for decades to come, inspiring countless books, movies, and cautionary tales about the evil that can lurk beneath the most ordinary appearances. Ed Gein had achieved a form of immortality, but it was the immortality of damnation, ensuring that his name would be whispered in fear and revulsion as long as human beings remembered the capacity for evil that existed within their own species. Story 3. Richard Ramirez, The Night Stalker, 1980s. In the suffocating darkness of a sweltering Los Angeles summer, evil walked among the sleeping. Between June 1984 and August 1985, a shadow-cloaked predator prowled the sprawling metropolis, slipping through unlocked windows and sliding doors like smoke through cracks in reality. His victims never heard him coming. They never saw the glint of steel in his hand or the demonic grin spreading across his rotted teeth until it was far too late. This is the story of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, a monster who turned the City of Angels into a living nightmare. For 14 months, he carved a bloody path of terror through Southern California, leaving behind a trail of mutilated corpses and shattered lives. His weapon of choice, whatever lay within reach, a hammer, a knife, a gun, his own bare hands, his signature, pentagrams carved into flesh and walls, and the chilling whisper that would haunt survivors forever. I am the Night Stalker. Tonight, we descend into the abyss of pure evil. We'll walk through blood-soaked crime scenes, peer into the twisted mind of a serial killer, and relive the hunt for one of America's most notorious murderers. But be warned, this is not a story for the faint of heart. This is a journey into darkness so profound, so utterly terrifying, that it will forever change how you view the safety of your own home. Lock your doors, check your windows, and pray that when you close your eyes tonight, you don't hear the soft footsteps of the Night Stalker approaching your bed. The desert wind howled through El Paso, Texas, on February 29, 1960, carrying with it an omen of the horror to come. On this cursed leap day, Julian and Mercedes Ramirez welcomed their fifth child into the world, a baby boy they named Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez. Little did they know they had given birth to a creature who would one day become the stuff of nightmares, a predator who would make parents across America afraid to let their children sleep with the windows open. Richard's childhood was a festering wound of violence and depravity that would eventually split open and bleed onto the streets of Los Angeles. The Ramirez household was a powder keg of rage, where Julian's fists spoke louder than words and terror was served with every meal. The elder Ramirez was a violent drunk whose explosive temper turned their home into a war zone. Night after night, young Richard cowered in corners as his father's rage erupted like a volcano, raining down blows on anyone within reach. But it was Richard's older cousin, Miguel, a Vietnam War veteran, who would plant the seeds of true evil in the boy's impressionable mind. Miguel was a walking corpse, a hollow-eyed specter who had returned from the jungles of Southeast Asia carrying darkness in his soul like a cancer. He regaled young Richard with graphic tales of torture, rape, and murder, his voice dripping with sick pleasure as he described the atrocities he had committed against Vietnamese civilians. The horror reached its crescendo when Miguel produced a collection of Polaroid photographs, grotesque trophies of his wartime savagery. Image after image of mutilated corpses, severed heads, and violated women passed before Richard's wide eyes like frames from a nightmare film reel. Miguel's voice became hypnotic, seductive, as he whispered the details of each killing, each act of brutalization, each moment when life drained from his victim's eyes. "You see, Ricardo," Miguel would whisper, his breath reeking of alcohol and death. "There's a rush when you take a life, a power that flows through you like electricity. The fear in their eyes, it's intoxicating." These sessions continued for months, each one driving the poison deeper into Richard's developing psyche. The photographs became his obsession, the stories his bedtime lullabies. At 13, Richard witnessed the ultimate lesson in violence when Miguel, in a drug-fueled rage, put a .38 caliber bullet through his wife Jessie's head during a domestic dispute. The explosion of blood and brain matter across the kitchen wall should have traumatized any normal child. Instead, Richard stood transfixed, watching life leave Jesse's body, feeling something dark and hungry awaken within him. The blood on the walls wasn't just Jesse's. It was Richard's innocence, splattered and irretrievable. From that moment forward, death became his obsession, violence his religion, and suffering his sacrament. As adolescence crept in like a malignant tumor, Richard's behavior grew increasingly disturbing. He developed an unhealthy fascination with Satanism, devouring books on the occult and practicing ritual sacrifices on neighborhood animals. Cats and dogs began disappearing from the area around his home, their mutilated remains later discovered in desert graves, carved with primitive pentagram symbols. His first taste of breaking and entering came at 14 when he began slipping into homes through unlocked doors and windows, not to steal, but simply to watch people sleep. He would stand in darkened bedrooms for hours, studying the rise and fall of his victims' chests, imagining what it would feel like to stop that rhythmic breathing forever. The power of holding life and death in his hands was more addictive than any drug. School became impossible. Richard's grades plummeted as his mind wandered to darker pursuits. Teachers described him as withdrawn, aggressive, and deeply disturbed. His few attempted friendships ended in violence. Other children instinctively sensed the predator lurking beneath his sullen exterior and kept their distance. The drugs came next: marijuana, cocaine, LSD, and PCP. Each chemical opened new doorways in his mind, revealing corridors of violence and depravity that normal people could never imagine. Under their influence, the line between reality and his darkest fantasies began to blur until they became indistinguishable. By 18, Richard had evolved into something barely human. His teeth, rotted by years of drug abuse and poor hygiene, gave him a ghoulish appearance that children found terrifying. His eyes, once capable of warmth, had become bottomless black pits that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When he smiled, which was rare and always disturbing, it was the grin of a predator who had just caught the scent of prey. Los Angeles called to him like a siren song of opportunity and anonymity. The sprawling metropolis offered millions of potential victims and countless ways to disappear into the urban landscape. In 1982, he made the pilgrimage west, carrying nothing but a duffel bag of clothes and a heart full of homicidal fantasies. The city of angels was about to meet its most diabolical demon. Richard's early months in Los Angeles were spent perfecting his craft. He haunted the seedier neighborhoods of downtown, studying the patterns of working-class families, learning the rhythms of suburban life. He memorized which houses left windows unlocked, which families kept irregular schedules, which neighborhoods had the fewest streetlights and police patrols. His first attempts at home invasion were clumsy, driven more by opportunity than planning. A few burglaries here and there, mostly targeting homes with obvious valuables visible through windows. But these material gains never satisfied the growing hunger within him. Money and jewelry couldn't feed the beast that Miguel had awakened. Only blood and terror could do that. The transition from burglar to killer was gradual, like a disease spreading through his system one cell at a time. At first, it was just fantasies that played out in his mind as he stood over sleeping victims. But fantasies weren't enough. The need to actualize the violence, to make it real and permanent, grew stronger with each passing night. He began carrying weapons, kitchen knives stolen from previous break-ins, a .22 caliber pistol purchased from a street dealer, brass knuckles that fit perfectly over his bony fingers. The weight of these instruments of death in his pockets gave him confidence, made him feel invincible. The occult became his guiding philosophy. He tattooed pentagrams on his palms and began leaving satanic symbols at crime scenes, believing they would give him power over his victims' souls. In his twisted mind, he wasn't just killing bodies. He was claiming eternal dominion over the spirits he released from their earthly prisons. Late at night, as he prowled the residential streets of Los Angeles, Richard Ramirez was no longer entirely human. He had become something else, a shadow with teeth, a nightmare given flesh, a walking embodiment of every parent's worst fears. The warm summer nights of 1984 were about to turn cold with the chill of death. Somewhere in the darkness, a window latch was being tested. A screen was being cut. Footsteps were approaching a bedroom where an innocent family slept, unaware that evil itself was about to cross their threshold. The Night Stalker was ready to feed. June 28, 1984. The date would forever be seared into the consciousness of Los Angeles as the night the city's innocence died. In the affluent suburb of Glassell Park, 79-year-old Jenny Vinkow was settling into her apartment for what she believed would be another peaceful evening. The retired schoolteacher had no way of knowing that death was already climbing through her bedroom window. Richard Ramirez moved through the darkness like liquid shadow, his rotted teeth gleaming in the pale moonlight as he sliced through the window screen with surgical precision. The sound of tearing mesh was barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning unit, but to Richard's heightened senses, it was a symphony of anticipation. His heart hammered against his ribs as adrenaline and drugs coursed through his system, creating a cocktail of euphoria and homicidal rage. Jenny stirred in her sleep as a cool breeze from the compromised window caressed her face, but she didn't wake. Not yet. Richard stood motionless in her bedroom doorway for nearly 10 minutes, his black eyes drinking in every detail of the scene. The way her gray hair spread across the pillow, the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest beneath the thin nightgown, the vulnerability of her position, alone and defenseless. This was the moment of choice, the final crossroads between fantasy and reality. In his mind, Miguel's voice whispered encouragement, urging him to take what he had been preparing for his entire life. The knife in his hand felt like an extension of his soul, cold steel hunger yearning to taste warm flesh. What happened next lasted only minutes but would echo through eternity. Richard's attack was savage, frenzied, and utterly without mercy. The blade found Jenny's throat with expert precision, opening it like a crimson flower blooming in the darkness. Her eyes snapped open, wide with terror and confusion, but she had no breath left to scream. Only a wet, gurgling sound escaped as her life pumped out onto the sheets in rhythmic spurts. But Richard wasn't finished. The kill had awakened something primal within him, a bloodlust that demanded complete domination. He violated her corpse in the most degrading way possible, treating her remains as nothing more than an object for his twisted gratification. When he finally stumbled away from the scene, her body was positioned in an obscene tableau of death and defilement that would haunt the first responders for years to come. The discovery of Jenny Vinkow's butchered remains sent shockwaves through the Los Angeles Police Department. Veteran detectives who had seen everything the city's underbelly could produce stood in stunned silence at the crime scene. The level of brutality was unprecedented, the sexual violence incomprehensible. This wasn't just murder. It was an announcement that something truly evil had arrived in their city. For Richard, the aftermath was intoxicating. The news reports describing the brutal slaying and savage attack fed his ego like a drug. He had crossed the final threshold from fantasy to reality, and the sensation was more powerful than he had ever imagined. The guilt that might have consumed a normal person was completely absent, replaced instead by a ravenous hunger for more. But one kill wasn't enough, could never be enough. The beast within him had tasted blood and now demanded a steady diet of death and suffering. Richard began planning his next attack before Jenny Vinkow's body was even cold. The Night Stalker had been born. 9 months passed before Richard struck again. 9 months of building anticipation and refining his methods. He spent this time like a student of murder, studying police procedures, learning from his mistakes, and perfecting his approach. The hiatus wasn't born of remorse. It was strategic preparation for the killing spree to come. March 17, 1985, marked the beginning of the true terror. In Rosemead, 22-year-old Maria Hernandez was returning home from dinner with her roommate when she noticed a figure lurking in the shadows near their apartment building. Something about the man's posture, the way he seemed to melt into the darkness, sent ice water through her veins. She quickened her pace, keys already in hand, but she wasn't fast enough. The gunshot shattered the quiet suburban evening like breaking glass. Richard's .22 caliber pistol barked once, the bullet catching Maria in the hand she had instinctively raised to protect her face. The impact spun her around, blood spraying across the apartment door as she fumbled with the locks. Behind her, She could hear footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate, like death itself taking its time. Inside the apartment, Maria's roommate Dale Yoshioka was awakened by the sound of the front door bursting open, followed by Maria's terrified screams. Before she could fully comprehend what was happening, Richard was standing in her bedroom doorway, his skeletal frame silhouetted against the hallway light. In his hand, the gun gleamed like a malevolent eye. "Don't look at me," he snarled, his voice like gravel being crushed underfoot. But Dale had already seen his face, had already memorized the hollow cheeks, the blackened teeth, the eyes that reflected no humanity whatsoever. That glimpse would cost her everything. The second gunshot was muffled by the pillow Richard pressed against Dale's head. The bullet punched through fabric, flesh, and bone, exploding out the other side in a spray of brain matter and blood that painted the wall behind the bed in abstract patterns of death. Her body convulsed once, twice, then lay still, steam rising from the exit wound in the cool night air. Richard stood over the corpse for several minutes, savoring the moment. This kill felt different from Jenny Vinco's, cleaner, more controlled. He was evolving, becoming more efficient in his methods. The .22 caliber rounds were perfect for close-range work, devastating enough to ensure death but small enough not to overpenetrate and alert neighbors. Meanwhile, Maria Hernandez lay bleeding in the hallway, playing dead and praying to every saint she could remember. She listened to the sounds coming from Dale's bedroom, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of fabric, the wet sounds she tried not to identify. When silence finally returned, she held her breath and waited. Richard emerged from the bedroom like a specter, pausing only to rifle through Dale's purse before making his way to the front door. He stepped over Maria's motionless form without a second glance, assuming she was already dead. It was a mistake that would later prove crucial to the investigation. The dual crime scene in Rosemead marked a turning point in Richard's methodology. He had discovered that he enjoyed the power of life and death that came with a firearm, but he also craved the intimate brutality of close-quarters killing. Future attacks would incorporate both elements, the efficiency of bullets and the personal satisfaction of edged weapons. 10 days later, the Night Stalker struck again, this time targeting a middle-class family in Whittier. Vincent and Maxine Zazera were a couple in their 60s who had worked hard their entire lives to build a comfortable retirement. They had no way of knowing that their choice to sleep with the bedroom window cracked open for fresh air would prove to be a fatal decision. Richard's entry into the Zazera home was his most brazen yet. Rather than the careful, silent approach he had used previously, he kicked in the front door with explosive violence, the sound echoing through the quiet neighborhood like a gunshot. Vincent Zazera, awakened by the noise, grabbed a baseball bat and stumbled toward the living room to investigate. The two men faced each other in the darkened hallway, the elderly homeowner clutching his makeshift weapon, the skeletal intruder holding a gun that gleamed like liquid mercury in the moonlight. For a moment that felt like eternity, neither moved. Then Richard's lips pulled back in that trademark rotted tooth grin, and he pulled the trigger. The first bullet caught Vincent in the temple, spinning him around like a broken marionette. But Richard wasn't satisfied with a quick kill. As the older man collapsed, the Night Stalker pumped 2 more rounds into his chest, the impacts making wet slapping sounds as they found their mark. Vincent Zazera died on his own living room floor, his blood seeping into the carpet he and his wife had picked out together just months before. Maxine's screams from the bedroom only inflamed Richard's bloodlust further. He found her cowering behind the bed, her nightgown torn and her face streaked with tears. The terror in her eyes was like a drug, sending waves of euphoria through his system more powerful than any narcotic he had ever consumed. What Richard did to Maxine Zazera over the next hour would haunt investigators for the rest of their careers. The brutality was so extreme, so utterly depraved, that crime scene photos had to be sealed to prevent them from traumatizing jury members. He tortured her with kitchen knives, carved pentagrams into her flesh while she was still alive, and violated her in ways that defied human comprehension. But the final act of degradation came after she was dead. Using a carving knife from their own kitchen, Richard removed Maxine's eyes with surgical precision, taking them as trophies. The empty sockets stared blindly at the ceiling, twin wells of darkness that seemed to reflect the void in her killer's soul. When police arrived the next morning, called by neighbors who had heard the screaming, they found a scene that would redefine their understanding of human evil. The Zazera home had been transformed into a charnel house, every room containing evidence of the prolonged torture session that had taken place within its walls. Detective Gil Carrillo, one of the first responders, later described it as stepping into hell itself. The smell of death and fear hung in the air like a tangible presence, and even veteran officers found themselves vomiting at the sight of what had been done to the elderly couple. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was the message Richard had left behind, carved into the bathroom mirror with the tip of his knife. Jack the Knife for President. It was his first direct communication with law enforcement, a taunt that revealed his growing confidence and his desire for notoriety. The Night Stalker was no longer content to kill in shadows. He wanted recognition, wanted the world to know his name and tremble at the mention of it. The reign of terror was just beginning, and Los Angeles had no idea how much worse it was going to get. The spring of 1985 melted into summer like blood pooling on hot asphalt, and with it came a terror unlike anything Los Angeles had ever experienced. The Night Stalker was no longer an isolated killer striking randomly. He had become a force of nature, a hurricane of violence that swept through the city's residential neighborhoods with increasing frequency and escalating brutality. The pattern was becoming clear to investigators, though the knowledge brought them no comfort. Richard Ramirez preferred homes in middle-class suburban areas, targeting families and elderly couples who lived quiet lives behind unlocked doors and open windows. His method of entry was always the same: cut window screens, jimmy sliding glass doors, or simply walk through entrances left unsecured by residents who still believed their neighborhoods were safe. May 14, 1985, brought death to the quiet suburb of Monrovia. William and Lily Doy, an elderly couple married for over 40 years, were asleep in their modest home when the sound of breaking glass shattered their dreams forever. Richard had grown bolder, no longer content with silent entries. The crash of the bedroom window exploding inward announced his arrival like the tolling of a funeral bell. William Doy, despite his advanced age, was still a fighter. The 66-year-old struggled against his attacker with the desperate strength that comes from protecting a loved one, but his aged muscles were no match for Richard's drug-fueled fury and razor-sharp knife. The blade found its mark again and again, opening crimson wounds across the old man's chest and arms as he fought to reach the telephone. "Please," William gasped, his voice growing weaker with each syllable. "Don't hurt my wife. Take whatever you want, but please." His plea was cut short by the knife sliding between his ribs, puncturing his lung and filling his mouth with the copper taste of his own blood. He collapsed beside the overturned nightstand, his fingers still grasping for the phone that might have saved them both. Lily Doy watched her husband die from the corner where Richard had shoved her, her frail body trembling like a leaf in a hurricane. At 63, she had survived the Great Depression, World War II, and the tumultuous decades that followed. But nothing in her long life had prepared her for the nightmare that now stood over her husband's cooling corpse. Richard turned to her with blood dripping from the knife blade, his hollow eyes reflecting a hunger that went beyond mere violence. What followed was a prolonged torture session that stripped away every shred of dignity and humanity from the scene. He violated the elderly woman in ways that transformed the bedroom into a chamber of horrors, her pleas for mercy only serving to increase his excitement. The pentagrams came next, carved into her flesh with the tip of his blade while she was still conscious enough to feel every agonizing cut. The 5-pointed stars weren't random. They were ritual markings, symbols of his devotion to the dark forces he believed empowered his killing spree. As Lily's life ebbed away, Richard whispered satanic incantations over her body, claiming her soul for his demonic master. But the Night Stalker wasn't finished with the Doy home. In a display of contempt for his victims and the investigators who would find them, he ransacked every room, leaving behind a trail of overturned furniture and scattered belongings. He made himself a sandwich in their kitchen, eating it while standing over William's corpse, the bread sticking to his rotted teeth as he chewed with mechanical precision. The discovery of the Doy's butchered remains the next morning sent shockwaves through the LAPD that reached all the way to the mayor's office. The level of violence was escalating beyond all previous parameters, and the ritualistic elements suggested a killer who was spiraling deeper into madness with each attack. Detective Gil Carrillo studied the crime scene photos until his eyes burned, searching for any clue that might lead to the monster responsible. The pentagrams carved into flesh, the satanic symbols drawn on walls in blood, the methodical degradation of the victims. It all pointed to a killer who saw himself as more than human, as an agent of supernatural evil. "This isn't just murder," Carrillo told his partner, Detective Frank Salerno. "This is something else entirely. This bastard thinks he's some kind of dark priest, and every kill is a sacrifice to whatever demon he worships." 3 days later, the nightmare deepened when Richard struck again in Monterey Park. Ruth Wilson, a 41-year-old nurse coming home from a late shift at the hospital, never saw the shadow that detached itself from the darkness beside her apartment building. The .25 caliber bullet entered her skull behind the left ear, the small round tumbling through brain tissue and destroying everything that made Ruth who she was. But Richard's bloodlust demanded more than a simple execution. He dragged her body inside, arranged it in an obscene position on her own bed, and spent hours defiling the corpse. The apartment became his personal playground of depravity, every room serving as a stage for different acts of posthumous violence. When he finally left through the same window he had entered, Ruth Wilson was no longer recognizable as human. The thing he left behind was a horror show of carved flesh and violated dignity, a message written in blood that screamed of the killer's complete disconnect from human empathy. The media had begun to take notice of the pattern of brutal home invasion murders plaguing Los Angeles. News reports spoke of a serial killer stalking suburban neighborhoods, but they had no name for the monster, no face to show frightened residents. He was simply described as a nighttime intruder who seemed to strike at random, leaving behind scenes of unimaginable carnage. Richard reveled in the coverage, recording news broadcasts on a stolen VCR and watching them repeatedly in the downtown flophouse where he had taken up residence. Seeing his handiwork described on television gave him a rush more powerful than any drug. He was becoming famous, achieving the notoriety he had craved since childhood. The attacks continued with increasing frequency throughout the brutal summer months. July brought death to Sierra Madre, where 16-year-old Whitney Bennett was beaten nearly to death with a tire iron while she slept. Only a neighbor's dog, whose frantic barking frightened Richard away before he could finish the job, saved the teenager's life. Whitney survived but would carry the physical and psychological scars of her encounter with the Night Stalker for the rest of her life. 3 days later, in Arcadia, 32-year-old Mary Louise Cannon wasn't so fortunate. The single mother was found in her bedroom, her throat slashed so deeply that she was nearly decapitated. Her young daughter, sleeping in the next room, somehow slept through the attack, a mercy that probably saved her life. The killer's methodology was evolving, becoming more sophisticated and more brutal with each attack. He had begun studying his victims in advance, learning their routines and identifying the best points of entry. Police found evidence that he had been watching some homes for weeks before striking, noting which windows were left unlocked and which family members stayed out late. August 8, 1985, brought the Night Stalker's most audacious attack yet. In Northridge, he invaded the home of Chris and Virginia Peterson, a couple in their 70s who had lived in the same house for over 30 years. But this time, something went wrong with Richard's carefully laid plans. Chris Peterson was a World War II veteran who kept a loaded .38 revolver in his nightstand drawer. When he heard the bedroom window being forced open, the old soldier grabbed his weapon and positioned himself behind the doorframe. As Richard's skeletal form emerged from the darkness, Peterson opened fire. The bullet caught Richard in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the dresser. Blood sprayed across the walls as he roared in pain and fury, more animal than human. But the wound only seemed to enrage him further. Drawing his own pistol, he returned fire, the muzzle flashes lighting up the bedroom like strobes at a nightclub. Virginia Peterson screamed as bullets flew around her, one round punching through the window behind her head and sending glass cascading onto the bed. Her husband, despite his age and the chaos erupting around him, kept his position and continued firing until his revolver clicked empty. In the sudden silence that followed, Richard could hear sirens approaching in the distance. Someone had called the police, and for the first time in his killing career, he was wounded and in danger of being captured. Clutching his bleeding shoulder, he stumbled through the house and escaped through the back door, leaving a trail of blood that would provide investigators with their first physical evidence. The attempted murder of the Petersons marked a turning point in the Night Stalker case. Richard had been wounded, his blood was now in police custody for analysis, and for the first time, he had been forced to flee from a potential victim. The aura of invincibility he had cultivated was beginning to crack. But rather than deterring him, the close call seemed to inflame his bloodlust even further. Within 48 hours of the Peterson attack, he struck again in Glendale, this time targeting the home of Ahmed Zia, a 35-year-old bus driver. The attack was so savage, so utterly brutal, that even hardened detectives struggled to process the crime scene. Richard had taken his time with Zia, torturing him for hours with a variety of implements found throughout the house. Kitchen knives, hammer, screwdrivers, even broken glass. Everything became a weapon in the Night Stalker's hands. The victim's screams had awakened neighbors, but by the time police arrived, they found only a corpse that had been transformed into an abstract sculpture of violence and hatred. The message was clear. The wound from Chris Peterson's gun had done nothing to slow down the monster stalking Los Angeles. If anything, it had made him more dangerous, more unpredictable, and infinitely more savage in his attacks. As August melted into its final weeks, the city held its collective breath. Parents kept their children indoors after dark, hardware stores sold out of window locks and security devices, and gun shops reported record sales as frightened residents armed themselves against the shadow that might be lurking outside their doors. But all the precautions in the world couldn't stop what was coming next. The Night Stalker was building towards something bigger, something that would terrorize Los Angeles like nothing before or since. The Summer of Fear was about to reach its horrifying climax, and when it did, the City of Angels would discover just how deep into hell one man could drag an entire metropolitan area. As August 1985 drew to its blood-soaked conclusion, Los Angeles had become a city under siege. The Night Stalker's reign of terror had transformed the sprawling metropolis into a paranoid landscape where every shadow might conceal death and every unlocked door could be an invitation to hell. But the killer's insatiable hunger for violence and notoriety would soon become the very weakness that led to his downfall. The police task force hunting Richard Ramirez had grown into the largest manhunt in Los Angeles history. Detectives Gil Carrillo and Frank Salerno worked around the clock, following leads that seemed to evaporate like smoke and chasing shadows that always stayed one step ahead of justice. The investigation had consumed their lives, turning them into hollow-eyed wraiths who saw pentagrams in their dreams and woke to the sound of screaming victims. But breakthrough evidence was finally beginning to emerge from the chaos. The blood samples from the Peterson house had been analyzed, revealing the killer's blood type. More importantly, partial fingerprints lifted from various crime scenes were being processed through the newly computerized identification system. For the first time since the killing spree began, law enforcement had physical evidence that could lead them to their quarry. On August 24, 1985, Richard struck what would become his most infamous attack, a night of horror that would forever be seared into the memory of Los Angeles. The Mission-style home in Mission Viejo belonged to Bill Carnes, a 29-year-old computer programmer, and his fiancée Inez Erickson, a 27-year-old teacher. They had spent the evening planning their upcoming wedding, blissfully unaware that their dreams of a future together were about to be shattered by a nightmare in human form. Richard's approach to the Carnes home showed the full evolution of his predatory skills. He had stalked the couple for weeks, learning their routines, identifying their vulnerabilities, and planning the perfect attack. Unlike his earlier random strikes, this was calculated, methodical, and designed to maximize both the physical and psychological damage he could inflict. The sliding glass door to their patio had been left unlocked, a detail Richard had noted during his surveillance. He moved through their home like a ghost, his footsteps making no sound on the hardwood floors as he made his way toward the bedroom where the couple slept peacefully, wrapped in each other's arms. The attack began with the cold kiss of steel against Bill's temple as Richard pressed the barrel of his .25 caliber pistol against the sleeping man's head. The sharp click of the hammer being cocked was loud enough to wake both victims, their eyes snapping open to find themselves staring into the face of pure evil. "Don't move, don't scream, or I'll blow your fucking heads off," Richard hissed, his rotted teeth gleaming in the pale moonlight streaming through the bedroom window. His voice was like broken glass being ground underfoot, each word dripping with the promise of unspeakable violence. What followed was 3 hours of sustained torture that pushed the boundaries of human endurance and cruelty. Richard forced the couple to participate in their own degradation, using them as props in a twisted theatrical production where he was both director and star. The bedroom became his personal stage for exploring the darkest recesses of human suffering. Bill Carnes took the worst of the initial violence. 3 bullets from Richard's pistol shattered his skull, the rounds ricocheting inside his cranium and destroying vast sections of brain tissue. Somehow, incredibly, he remained alive but completely paralyzed, forced to watch helplessly as the Night Stalker turned his attention to Inez. The assault on Inez Erickson was a masterclass in psychological torture designed to break her spirit completely. Richard didn't just want to kill her. He wanted to own her soul, to transform her into a broken shell that would carry his mark forever. He forced her to swear allegiance to Satan, to repeat blasphemous oaths while he carved pentagrams into her flesh with a kitchen knife stolen from their own drawer. "Say you love Satan," he demanded, pressing the blade against her throat hard enough to draw blood. "Say it, or I'll cut your boyfriend's eyes out while you watch." Inez complied, her voice breaking with each word as she spoke the unholy phrases he demanded. But her submission only seemed to inflame his appetite for degradation. He violated her in ways that stripped away every shred of dignity, turning her body into a canvas for his artwork of pain and humiliation. The pentagrams he carved into her skin were deeper than usual, more elaborate in their design. He was creating a masterpiece of satanic symbolism, marking her as his property for whatever dark forces he believed would claim her soul. Each cut was precise, deliberate, designed to cause maximum pain while ensuring she remained conscious throughout the ordeal. But Richard's greatest mistake came in his moment of supreme arrogance. Rather than killing both victims outright, he chose to let Inez live, not out of mercy, but as a testament to his power. He wanted her to survive, to carry his mark into the world as a living advertisement of his capabilities. Before leaving, he made her swear on Satan's name that she wouldn't call police for 15 minutes. "If you break your oath to the Dark Lord," he whispered, his breath reeking of decay and death, "I'll know, and I'll come back to finish what I started." But Inez Erickson was stronger than Richard had calculated. Despite her injuries, despite the trauma that should have left her catatonic, she managed to call 911 within minutes of his departure. Her voice, broken but determined, gave police their first eyewitness description of the Night Stalker's face. More importantly, she was able to provide details about his car, a stolen orange Toyota that would become the key to his capture. The net was finally closing around Richard Ramirez, though he remained blissfully unaware of how close the hunters had come. His arrogance had grown with each successful kill, convincing him that he was protected by supernatural forces that made him untouchable. This hubris would prove to be his ultimate downfall. On August 30th, 1985, police got their first major break in the case. A stolen orange Toyota matching Inez Erickson's description was found abandoned in a Rampart District parking lot, its interior a treasure trove of forensic evidence. Fingerprints lifted from the steering wheel and door handles were run through the computerized identification system, and for the first time since the killing spree began, they got a match. The name that appeared on the computer screen sent shockwaves through the task force. Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez, a 25-year-old drifter with a history of drug arrests and petty crimes. His mugshot showed a gaunt face dominated by hollow, dead eyes and a mouth full of rotted teeth, exactly matching the descriptions provided by survivors. Detective Gil Carrillo stared at the photograph for long minutes, memorizing every detail of the face that had haunted his nightmares for over a year. This was the monster they had been hunting, the shadow that had transformed Los Angeles into a city of fear. He looked so ordinary, so pathetically human, that it was almost impossible to reconcile his appearance with the inhuman brutality of his crimes. "Got you, you son of a bitch," Carrillo whispered, his fingers tracing the outline of Richard's face on the printout. "Finally got you." But having a name and photograph was only the beginning. Richard Ramirez had disappeared into the urban underground of Los Angeles like smoke dissipating in the wind. He could be anywhere, living in abandoned buildings, crashing with drug dealers, or hiding in the sprawling network of tunnels beneath the city. Finding him would require resources on a scale never before deployed in a serial killer investigation. The decision was made at the highest levels of the LAPD to release Richard's name and photograph to the media. On August 31st, 1985, every television station and newspaper in Southern California carried the same headline: "Night Stalker Identified." The grainy black and white mugshot that had haunted the dreams of detectives was now burned into the retinas of 6 million Los Angeles residents. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Tips poured into police stations from across the metropolitan area as citizens reported sightings of the suspect. Most were false alarms, shadows that resembled the photograph or strangers whose appearance triggered paranoid suspicions. But somewhere in that flood of information was the genuine lead that would bring the Night Stalker's reign of terror to an end. Richard, meanwhile, had been blissfully unaware of how close the authorities had come to identifying him. He was in Phoenix, Arizona, visiting his brother and contemplating his next series of attacks. The desert city seemed ripe with potential victims, and he was already conducting surveillance on several suburban neighborhoods when fate dealt him the cruelest blow of all. On the morning of August 31st, he walked into a convenience store to buy cigarettes and candy, still high from the previous night's drug binge. The elderly clerk behind the counter looked up as he approached, and Richard watched in confusion as the man's face went pale with recognition and terror. Above the clerk's head, a small television was tuned to the morning news. Richard followed the man's gaze upward and felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. His own face stared back at him from the screen, accompanied by the anchor's voice describing him as one of the most wanted men in America. "The suspect is considered extremely dangerous," the newscaster continued, "and should not be approached by civilians. If you see this man, contact police immediately." The realization hit Richard like a physical blow. His photograph was being broadcast to millions of people. His name was being repeated on every news channel. The supernatural protection he had believed in so completely had abandoned him, leaving him exposed and vulnerable in a world that now knew exactly who and what he was. He stumbled out of the store without buying anything, leaving the terrified clerk to immediately call 911. But Richard was already moving, his survival instincts kicking in as he realized that Phoenix was no longer safe. He needed to get back to Los Angeles, back to the familiar streets and hiding places he knew like the back of his scarred hand. The Greyhound bus trip back to California became a journey through hell. Every passenger seemed to be staring at him. Every stop brought the possibility of recognition and capture. Richard pulled a baseball cap low over his face and tried to make himself invisible, but he couldn't escape the feeling that the walls were closing in around him. He arrived in Los Angeles on the morning of August 31st, stepping off the bus into a city that had been transformed overnight into a hunting ground with him as the prey. His photograph was displayed on every newsstand, his face plastered on telephone poles and storefront windows. The people of Los Angeles had been mobilized into a citizen army with a single mission: find the Night Stalker and bring him to justice. Richard tried to blend into the crowd as he made his way through downtown, but his distinctive appearance made anonymity impossible. The rotted teeth, the gaunt frame, the hollow eyes. Every detail that had once made him a figure of terror now served as a beacon for the thousands of people searching for him. His first indication that the city had turned against him came in East Los Angeles, where he attempted to carjack a woman at a traffic light. As he approached her vehicle with a screwdriver in his hand, she looked up and screamed, "It's him! It's the Night Stalker!" Her screams brought people running from every direction. Shop owners, pedestrians, construction workers, all converging on Richard like antibodies attacking a virus. He ran, but the crowd followed, growing larger and more aggressive with each passing block. In the Boyle Heights neighborhood, his luck finally ran out. Attempting to steal a car from a driveway, Richard was spotted by the homeowner, Faustino Pinion, who immediately recognized the face that had been seared into every Los Angeles resident's memory. El Matador, Pinion shouted in Spanish. The killer! Within minutes, the entire neighborhood had mobilized. Men emerged from houses carrying baseball bats, hammers, and pieces of rebar. Women called police while keeping watch from windows and doorways. Children were hurried inside as their parents prepared to confront the monster who had terrorized their city for over a year. Richard ran through the streets like a wounded animal, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the mob pursued him with righteous fury. This was justice in its most primal form. A community rising up to defend itself against a predator who had shown no mercy to their neighbors, their families, their children. The end came on Hubbard Street, where Richard attempted to drag Angelina de la Torre from her car as she returned from grocery shopping. But de la Torre's husband, Manuel, was working in his garage and heard his wife's screams. He emerged with a steel bar in his hand, his eyes blazing with the kind of anger that had been building in Los Angeles for 14 months. "You picked the wrong neighborhood, cabron," Manuel snarled, advancing on Richard with murderous intent. The Night Stalker, the shadow who had stalked the city's dreams, suddenly found himself surrounded by ordinary citizens who refused to be afraid anymore. They formed a circle around him, cutting off every avenue of escape, their faces reflecting the collective rage of a community that had been pushed beyond its breaking point. The beating was swift and merciless. Fists and feet connected with Richard's body from every direction, each blow carrying the weight of every sleepless night, every locked door, every frightened child who had asked if the monster was going to hurt them. This was retribution delivered by the people themselves, justice administered by those who had suffered most under his reign of terror. When police finally arrived, they found Richard Ramirez, the infamous Night Stalker, lying in the street, bloody and broken, surrounded by the very community he had tried to terrorize. His capture by citizens rather than law enforcement was a fitting end to his criminal career, a final humiliation for a man who had believed himself to be beyond the reach of ordinary people. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Richard looked up at the crowd of faces surrounding him and saw not fear, but disgust and contempt. The terror he had worked so hard to inspire had been replaced by something far more damaging to his ego: pity for a pathetic creature who had mistaken brutality for power. "I am the Night Stalker," he whispered through swollen lips, making one final attempt to reclaim the fear he had once inspired. But the spell was broken. He was no longer a nightmare made flesh, no longer a shadow that parents used to frighten children into obedience. He was just Richard Ramirez, a broken man whose reign of terror had ended not with supernatural intervention or police heroics, but with the simple courage of ordinary citizens who decided they had had enough. The trial that followed would reveal the full scope of his crimes: 13 confirmed murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries committed during his 14-month spree. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony devastating, and the verdict never in doubt. On November 7, 1989, Richard Ramirez was sentenced to death for his crimes. As the judge read the sentence, Richard showed no emotion, no remorse, no recognition of the suffering he had caused. Even facing execution, he remained convinced that he was special, that he was chosen by dark forces to bring chaos to the world. "You don't understand," he told reporters as he was led away to death row. "Serial killing is an art form. I am an artist." But the families of his victims knew better. They understood that Richard Ramirez was no artist. He was simply a coward who had preyed upon the innocent and defenseless. His crimes were not art but abomination, not creativity but destruction of everything good and pure in the world. The Night Stalker spent the next 23 years on death row at San Quentin State Prison, his body slowly consuming itself as cancer spread through his organs like the evil he had once spread through Los Angeles. He died on June 7, 2013, not by execution but by the natural consequences of a lifetime spent poisoning himself with drugs and hatred. His death was as pathetic and meaningless as his life had been. No crowds gathered to mourn him, no memorials were erected in his honor. He simply faded away, leaving behind only the scars he had inflicted on his surviving victims and the families of those he had murdered. But the city of Los Angeles had learned something important from its encounter with evil. It had discovered that darkness could only triumph when good people chose to do nothing, and that even the most terrifying predator could be brought down when a community decided to stand together against the forces that threatened its children. The Night Stalker was dead. The nightmare was over, and Los Angeles could finally sleep peacefully again, secure in the knowledge that sometimes, just sometimes, justice prevails over evil and light conquers the darkness that lurks in the human heart. The monsters are real. They walk among us, hiding behind human faces and ordinary lives. But they can be stopped. They can be caught. And when they are, it is often not by heroes with badges and guns, but by ordinary people who refuse to let fear rule their lives. This is the lesson of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, that evil may be powerful, but it is never as powerful as a community united against it. In the end, he was just a man, as mortal and fallible as anyone else. And like all men who choose darkness over light, he ultimately faced the consequences of his choices. The city sleeps, the nightmare is over, and somewhere in the darkness, other predators take note and realize that Los Angeles, the city of angels, will not go quietly into their good night. Thank you for watching and joining us as we explored these chilling and haunting true crime stories. If you enjoyed this journey into the darkest corners of human nature, be sure to like, subscribe, and share with others who are captivated by these twisted stories. We appreciate you taking the time to be a part of this, and we'll see you next time for more gripping and disturbing stories. Stay safe, stay curious, and remember, sometimes the truth is scarier than fiction.